gunshot tears the night open. In the doorway of a farmhouse, a woman stands straight-backed, the Colt still smoking in her hands, and below the porch steps a man goes down before she's had time to see his face. Gunpowder crawls across the yard. Thick, bitter. Somewhere out past the barn, a horse screams. Then nothing. Her hands don't shake. That's the part that ought to frighten you, because a widow out here is supposed to shake, supposed to weep, supposed to go down on her knees and beg. But those fingers close around the grip, sure and easy, the way hands only move when they've done this work before somewhere else, under another name, in a life this town has never once heard whispered. On the porch boards, a second boot falls, slow, careful. Whoever it is knows exactly which plank complains. She turns the barrel toward the dark, and the dark says her name. Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 1883. The dark doesn't ask permission. It just comes. Gunpowder in the air. Thick, bitter, curling through a busted window like something alive. A horse screaming somewhere. A man screaming somewhere else. Except the man stops first. A woman stands in the doorway of a farmhouse with a Colt held steady in both hands. Small frame. Wind-whipped hair loose from its pins. Breath coming out white and fast in the cold. Behind her, lamplight spills weak and orange across a kitchen floor scattered with broken glass. A chair overturned. A curtain torn half off its rod, still swaying. She doesn't flinch when the second shadow rushes the porch steps. Doesn't flinch when the moonlight catches the blade in his hand, or the ugly promise written plain across his face. Because flinching is a thing the mind does when it still believes there's a choice left to make. Hers had already made its choice a full second before her body caught up to it. She fires. He drops. Silence then. The kind that rings in your ears after. The kind that makes a person's hands shake once the danger's gone. Because the body only lets you feel afraid after it decides you're safe. Her hands don't shake. That's the part nobody in Cedar Hollow would have believed. Not the sheriff. Not the neighbors who whispered about the widow on the north section. Not the men who rode up her road tonight thinking she'd be easy. A lone woman. A lonely stretch of dirt. Ripe for taking. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Some of them just dead. But this isn't where the story starts. This is only where it was always going to end up. 3 months earlier. Because that's where the real story begins. Before the Gunsmoke. Before the questions nobody in town wanted answered out loud. Before a name buried a dozen years back started clawing its way up out of the ground. 3 months earlier, and none of it had happened yet. Wyoming Territory in those years was a country still deciding what it wanted to become. Cattle outfits pushed their herds across grass that had never once felt a fence. Homesteaders broke sod their grandparents' back. East would never have recognized as farmland at all. The bighorns stood purple and snow-capped along the western edge of everything, indifferent to the small, fierce lives playing out in their shadow, the same way mountains are always indifferent to the people who live and die beneath them. It was beautiful country, and it was hard country, and most days it demanded a person choose which truth mattered more before the sun even fully cleared the horizon. Addie had made her choice 8 years back, the day she stepped off a stage into dust and wind and a future she'd built entirely from scratch. She'd never once regretted it, not even now, with trouble riding toward her on good horses wearing fine hats. Adeline Prescott didn't know how to be small, not the way people meant it, standing in the mercantile with their voices pitched just loud enough to carry over the flour sacks. Poor thing. Alone out there. Won't last the winter. Mark it. She was small the way a knife is small. Nobody notices the size until it's already done its work. 26 years old. 5'3" in boots that had walked more miles than most men's had by 40. Hair the color of wheat gone dark with rain, pulled back plain because there was nobody left to dress it up for. A face that made men in town go quiet mid-sentence and then pretend they hadn't. She never asked for that. Didn't want it either. Out here, beauty wasn't a gift. It was a target painted on a woman who already had enough aimed at her. Because that was the plain truth of it. Because a widow alone on 160 acres was a widow. The whole territory seemed to think belonged to somebody. To the bank. To the church ladies with their casseroles and their pity, arranged on their faces like Sunday hats. To the men who came sniffing around 6 weeks after Wendell went into the ground, hats in their hands, sorrow rehearsed and ready. She turned every one of them away. which didn't stop them coming. Nothing ever stopped that. The Prescott land sat on a shelf of good bottom ground between two dry ridges, fed by a creek that still ran in August, when half of Cedar Hollow's wells had already gone to mud. Wendell had loved that creek, staked his claim on it in the spring of '75. The same season, Addie stepped off the stage from Montana, still learning to answer to a new name, and married him 3 months later, on the strength of nothing but his steadiness and her own exhausted hope that steadiness might be enough. It had been. For 8 quiet years, it had been exactly enough. She still remembered the exact afternoon he'd asked her, down by that same creek, wringing his hat in his hands like a man twice as nervous as any of the outlaws she'd later faced down without blinking. He hadn't spoken of love, not that first afternoon. Had spoken instead of steadiness, of wanting somebody to build something lasting alongside, of a quiet certainty that she was the kind of woman a man could trust his whole future to without once looking back. She hadn't loved him yet, not that day. Had married him anyway, on the strength of everything he'd promised and the desperate hope that a life built on steadiness might finally let her stop running. And somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of years that followed the planting seasons, the small kindnesses, the particular way he'd hum off key while mending harness in the evenings, she'd come to love him after all. Slow and real, and entirely her own choosing, in a way nothing before Wyoming had ever been. That was the cruelest part of losing him, she thought sometimes, in the worst hours of the night. Not simply that he was gone, but that the love itself had been so hard-won, so deliberately built out of nothing but patience and time, and taken from her before she'd ever gotten to spend even half of what she'd saved up. He'd been wrong about one thing, though. He used to say hard work was the only currency that mattered out here. He hadn't lived long enough to learn otherwise. Addie woke before the sun most mornings now. Habit, maybe. Or maybe the body simply refusing to rest easy in a bed built for two. She fed the chickens, milked the one stubborn cow she hadn't sold off in the lean months after the funeral, walked the fence line with a rifle slung across her back, not because she expected trouble, but because a woman alone learns fast that expecting nothing is how you end up buried next to your husband. She never once walked that fence line by way of the little rise above the creek, though it would have shortened her route considerably most mornings. The rise where Wendell lay, still unmarked 5 months on. She told herself the longer path was simply habit, the same way everything else about her mornings had become habit. She knew, somewhere underneath the telling, that it was something closer to cowardice. A grave without a stone felt less final. Somehow, and less final was the only mercy grief had left to offer her most days. The rifle had belonged to her father. Or so she told anyone who asked, which nobody ever did, because nobody in Cedar Hollow knew the first thing about her father. She'd arrived 8 years back as somebody's young bride, and that was the only history the town had ever cared to know. Twice a month she rode into Cedar Hollow, proper for supplies, and twice a month the town gave her the same performance. Not unkind, exactly. Just careful. Careful the way people are careful around a grave. They haven't decided, is finished settling yet. The mercantile owner, a stooped man named Whitlow, who'd known Wendell since before the marriage, always weighed her flour a little generous, and never once mentioned it. The women's outside the dry goods store always lowered their voices, half a beat too late, so the words still carried. Poor thing, so young to be alone. Somebody ought to look in on her more. Nobody looked in on her more. That was the part they never seemed to notice about their own pity. It cost them nothing, and it changed nothing, and it left her exactly as alone as she'd been before they'd spent it on her. She didn't mind, particularly. Alone had its uses. Alone meant nobody watching close enough to notice the calluses on her palms that a lady's hands weren't supposed to carry, or the way her eyes swept a room on entering it, corners first, same as doorways, same as the empty stretch of road behind her. Alone meant nobody asking why. That particular Tuesday, she'd gone in only for nails and a length of wire, and left with both, plus a stranger's worth of unwanted advice from the mercantile owner's wife about wolves coming down off the high country early this year on account of the cold snap. Wolves, the woman had said, pressing a hand to her own chest like the very word cost her something. You be careful out there alone, Mrs. Prescott. Addie had thanked her and ridden home and thought nothing further of wolves at all. She should have. because the trouble riding toward her that season wasn't coming down off any mountain. It was coming up the north road on good horses, wearing better hats than any honest cattleman needed, and it walked on 2 legs, same as she did. Except there were things kept in a tin box under a loose floorboard that told an entirely different story. A story she hadn't looked at in years, hadn't needed to, hadn't wanted to. Some mornings the wanting came back anyway, sat in her chest like a held breath she couldn't quite let go. She always pushed it back down. That morning, the morning that started everything. Though she didn't know it, yet she was mending a stretch of fence when Silas Kane's men came up the north road in a column of dust visible from half a mile off. 3 riders, good horses. Hats a good deal finer than any honest cattleman needed. Addie set down her wire cutters. Didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the post. Not yet. A woman who reaches too soon looks frightened. A woman who waits looks like nothing worries her at all. She wasn't going to hand them either. Morning, Mrs. Prescott. The lead rider was a man named Garrett, foreman of the Kane spread, big through the shoulders and soft through the eyes, in a way that made him look kinder than he was. He touched his hat, didn't dismount. Mr. Kane sends his regards. Does he wanted me to relay an offer? A generous one. $15 an acre for the whole parcel. Cash money. Clear title. No fuss. Addie looked past him. At the creek running silver through the low ground. At the barn Wendell had raised with his own 2 hands the summer before he died. At the little rise where she still hadn't found the will to plant a proper marker, because a marker made the whole thing permanent. In a way her heart hadn't caught up to yet. This land isn't for sale. Mr. Kane figured you'd say that. Garrett's horse shifted beneath him, impatient. Figured I should also mention. Winter's coming hard this year. A man alone can weather that fine. A woman alone. I've weathered 2 winters alone already, Mr. Garrett. Yes, ma'am. Whole towns remarked on it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a threat. Not quite. Not one either. Some folks call it a miracle you've managed. Others say miracles run out. Addie's hand found the rifle. Slow, unhurried. Like reaching for nothing more urgent than a coffee cup. Tell Mr. Kane. I said no. Same as last month. Same as the month before that. Garrett studied her a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face made him rein his horse back a full step, though he'd never once admit to it, not even to himself. Riding home. I'll relay the message. He touched his hat again. Careful out here, Mrs. Prescott. Lonely land does things to a mind, makes folks see threats where there aren't any, or miss the ones that are. Then he wheeled his horse and the 3 of them rode off the way they'd come, dust rising behind them like a curtain, closing on a stage nobody had asked to watch. Addie stood there a long while after, rifle still in hand, heart still steady, because that was the thing about her heart it had learned a long time ago, not to race for men like Garrett. Men like Garrett were noise. It was the quiet ones a person needed to fear. She just didn't know yet how quiet this particular trouble was going to be, or how loud it would get before it was through. That night she dreamed about her father. She didn't do that often anymore. Used to, in the first year after she buried him, the false burial, the empty box under Montana soil beneath a stone, carved with a name that wasn't quite his own, but the dreams had faded the way most things fade. Grief goes soft at the edges if a person leaves it alone long enough. Except this dream wasn't soft. This dream had his voice in it, low and even, the exact way it used to sound over gun oil and cleaning rags at the kitchen table, when she was 13 going on 14. Too young, he'd said once, and then corrected himself in the same breath. Except not too young. Not really. Not for a girl growing up the way she was growing up. Watch the hands, Addie girl. Not the eyes. Eyes lie. Hands don't. She woke with the words still hanging in the dark above her bed. For one unguarded moment, the kind that slips away the second you try to hold it. She thought she smelled gun oil in the room. Then it was gone. Just wood smoke from the banked stove and cold Wyoming night, pressing hard against the window panes. She lay there a long while, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Wendell. He'd been a good man. Not exciting. Not the kind who made her pulse quicken the way certain other memories still did. Memories she'd trained herself not to visit. But good. Steady. He'd looked at her like she was something worth building an entire life around. And after everything that had come before him, the running, the hiding, the years of being told her own name wasn't safe to say, out loud steady, had felt like the finest gift anyone had ever offered her. He'd died in March. A fall from his horse out past the east ridge, they said. A bad patch of ice, a startled animal. A man thrown wrong and left too long in the cold before anybody found him. She'd believed it. At the time. She wasn't sure anymore why that particular word believed had started feeling so uncertain lately. Like a stone worked its way into her boot without her noticing, until it had already rubbed the skin raw. Maybe it was Garrett's visit. Maybe it was Kane's sudden interest in ground he'd never once looked twice at while Wendell was alive. Maybe it was nothing at all. Just a widow's grief finding some new and stranger shape to wear. Or maybe it was the dream. Her father's voice. Watch the hands. Not the eyes. She didn't sleep again that night. The Kane Ranch sat 6 miles east, a spread so large it swallowed 3 creeks and half a mountain, and still wanted more. Silas Kane had built it from nothing over 20 years, and men who'd known him the whole while said the nothing was still in him somewhere, buried under the cattle and the money and the fine tailored coat he wore even out here, where nothing but cows and coyotes would ever appreciate the tailoring. He hadn't started out cruel. That was the part the ranch hands who'd worked for him longest still remembered and never spoke of, because the memory sat uncomfortable alongside the man he'd since become. He'd arrived in the territory with nothing but a wagon and a young wife who'd died of fever their second winter, buried out past the north fence in a plot he still, to this day, never once visited. He'd built the ranch afterward out of something that had started as grief and calcified, slowly, year over year, into pure and singular ambition, as though enough land, enough cattle, enough careful accumulation might finally fill whatever the fever had hollowed out of him. It never had. Whatever he'd told himself about the railroad money, about the fine coat and the growing acreage, none of it had ever once made him feel the way that young wife's laughter used to. On evenings so distant now, he sometimes wondered if he'd invented them entirely. He'd simply stopped noticing the absence somewhere along the way and mistaken the numbness for peace. He was standing at his study window when Garrett returned with the news, watching storm clouds build gray and heavy over the byhorns. She said no again. Kane didn't turn around. Of course she did. Same as every time, Mr. Kane. Polite as church, firm as a nailed door. She's not going to sell, Garrett. I stopped expecting a yes 6 weeks back. Kane finally turned, and something in his face didn't match the gentleman's coat or the gentleman's manners at all. Something colder, older, which means we stop asking politely. Garrett shifted his weight. You want me to send men out? Rough her up some, scare her into. I want you to think, for once in your life, about what a frightened woman does with a rifle in her hand. Kane crossed to his desk, where a rolled document sat weighted down, beneath a chunk of raw silver ore that hadn't come from anywhere near Wyoming. There are men coming through this territory, come spring, who care a great deal about that stretch of ground the Prescott widow happens to be sitting on, men whose patience I do not control, and whose money I very much intend to keep controlling me. So no, we are not going to scare her, then what? Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. It rarely did. We are going to make her situation untenable. Property values shift, Garrett. Fences get cut in the night. Cattle wander onto land they oughtn't. Bad things happen to lonely places, and lonely places have a curious habit of getting sold eventually to whoever's kind enough to make the offer. He unrolled the document an inch, just enough to show a survey line drawn in careful ink, running straight and unbroken through 160 acres that belonged, for now at least, to a farmer's widow who had no earthly idea what she was sitting on. And if she doesn't scare, everyone scares, Garrett. Kane rolled the paper shut again. The trick's only ever in knowing which fear to use. Outside, the storm finally broke, and the season's first hard rain came down over the bighorns like something being washed clean, or something being prepared for. The days between carried their own quiet warnings, small enough that Addie almost talked herself out of noticing them. A section of fence found down on the third morning, posts snapped clean rather than rotted through. Cattle that weren't hers, grazing the low pasture on the fifth, gone again by the time she rode out with a rifle to move them off. A gate left open on the 7th that she distinctly remembered closing. Small things. Things a woman living alone could talk herself into blaming on wind or luck or her own tired memory. She didn't talk herself into any of it. Not really. Because underneath the reasonable explanations sat a colder, older certainty The kind that lived in the body rather than the mind. Somebody was testing the edges of her, learning her habits, learning when the house sat dark and when it didn't, which nights she banked the stove early and which nights she sat up. She started sleeping with the Colt beneath her pillow, instead of the tin box beneath the floor. Started walking the fence line twice a day instead of once. Started listening, really listening, to the particular language her own home spoke. After dark, which boards complained under a footstep, which door hinge needed oil, and which one she'd deliberately left dry, because a hinge that complained was a hinge that gave a person warning. She never mentioned any of it to a soul. Who would she have told? The sheriff who'd already made his sympathies plain without saying a word. The mercantile owner's wife who'd only add wolves to her worrying and never once guessed the truth of what actually stalked the Prescott land. So she watched and waited, and on the 11th night the waiting finally ended. The attack came 11 nights later, a Tuesday. Addie would remember that detail forever after. A Tuesday, the most ordinary day there is. The day nothing was ever supposed to happen. She'd gone to bed early, tired from a day spent patching the henhouse roof, and woke sometime past midnight to a sound that didn't belong. A boot on gravel. Careful. Trying hard not to be heard and failing, because the men Kane sent didn't know this land the way she did. Didn't know which stones near the porch sat loose and which didn't. Didn't understand that a woman alone in wild country learns every sound her home makes the same way a mother learns her own child's cries. Her eyes opened in the dark, and for one full heartbeat her mind offered up every gentle explanation available. A raccoon at the feed bin. A branch, wind-loosed, dragging across the porch roof. The kind of explanation a tired woman wants desperately to believe, because believing it means she gets to close her eyes again. She didn't close her eyes again, because underneath the gentle explanations sat a colder certainty her body had already recognized, before her mind had finished arguing against it. That wasn't wind. Wind didn't pause between steps. Wind didn't wait, listening. The way a man does when he isn't yet certain the house he's approaching is as asleep as it appears. She was up and moving before the second boot fell. No lamp. Light gave you away. That lesson lived so deep in her, she couldn't remember learning it, at all the kind of thing that just settles into the body from the start and never leaves. The tin box came out from under the floorboard first. Her hands found the Colt inside without needing her eyes. Fingers closing around, a grip worn smooth by another hand. Decades before hers ever touched it. Her father's gun. The one she'd carried out of Montana, bundled in a stack of clothes at 18. Running from a life she'd never asked for, toward a new one she built brick by careful brick, name by careful name, until even she had almost believed the story she told herself about who she was. Almost. Glass broke at the kitchen window. A voice, low, not bothering with quiet anymore. "She's alone in there," Garrett said easy. "Garrett ain't the one climbing through the window, is he?" Addie stood in the dark hallway of her own home with a gun in her hand that hadn't fired anything larger than a rattlesnake in 8 long years, and something in her chest that had been sleeping a very long time, finally. Fully woke up. She didn't feel fear. That surprised her later, once there was time to think about it properly. What she felt instead was something closer to memory. Her body remembering a language her mind had worked hard to forget. Watch the hands, not the eyes. The first man came through the front door, not the window, boots loud on the porch boards, pistol already drawn and swinging low, like he expected nothing but a hysterical woman in a nightgown who'd never so much as heard a gunshot in her life. He got 2 steps inside, before Addie put a bullet through his shoulder from the hallway shadow, and the shock on his face in the half-second before he crumpled was almost worth remembering. Almost. The gunshot brought the second man around from the kitchen window at a dead run, hollering something that might have been her name or might have been a curse, and Addie was already moving. Already low, already somewhere in her mind. That wasn't Cedar Hollow at all anymore. Somewhere older. A kitchen table. Gun oil. A patient. Even voice. Elbow up. Breathe out. Let the shot find the space between 2 heartbeats. She fired once. He went down in the doorway and didn't get back up. Outside, a third voice, the one giving orders, the one who'd stayed near the horses, like a man too smart to get his own hands dirty, swore long and loud, and then hoofbeats went fast and hard, fading east, toward the Kane ranch, toward Silas Kane's fine study window, and his rolled-up survey document, and his cold, patient smile. Addie stood in her own doorway afterward, gun still warm in her hand, breath coming out white and fast in the freezing night, looking down at two men bleeding into her porch boards. One of them groaned. Alive then. Barely. She should have felt something. Horror. Sickness. Whatever decent women were supposed to feel when violence came into their homes, and they were forced to answer it in kind. What she felt instead was quiet. A terrible, clean quiet, like a held breath, finally let go. Because this cold competence, this steady hand, this bone-deep understanding of exactly where to aim and precisely when to fire, this wasn't supposed to still live in her. She'd buried it years ago, married it away, hidden it beneath 8 years of henhouses and fence mending and a husband's plain, ordinary love, and it had been waiting the entire time, patient as Kane's own ambition, just under the surface, just under the floorboard, right beside the tin box, right beside the gun. She looked down at her hands in the moonlight, steady, not shaking at all. That frightened her more than the men on her porch ever had. She sat up the rest of that night in the kitchen chair nearest the door, rifle across her knees, listening to the wounded man's breathing turn ragged and shallow out on the porch boards. He asked for water once, near the middle of the night, voice thin and pleading in a way that might have moved her a week earlier, before he'd broken into her home in the dark meaning to do worse to her than thirst. She didn't move to help him. Didn't move to finish him either, though some cold, unfamiliar part of her noted that she could have easily, and instead simply sat with the weight of that choice settling over her like the cold itself. Mercy and justice, she was learning, didn't always point the same direction, and a person alone in the dark sometimes had to choose between them without anybody else there to share the choosing. He was still breathing, barely, when the sky finally began to gray toward morning. Sheriff Amos Pratt arrived at dawn, unhurried, the way he did most everything. A heavy-set man with a mustache gone gray before its time, and a manner so folksy, it took most folks years to notice how little he actually accomplished with it. He stood over the wounded man and shook his head, like the whole affair was a terrible inconvenience visited on his personal morning. Well, he straightened, joints popping audibly. This is a mess, Mrs. Prescott. They broke into my home, Sheriff. Middle of the night. Armed. So it appears. He glanced toward the barn, the fence, the far tree line, everywhere but at her, in the particular way of a man carefully not seeing something. Any notion who might have sent them? You already know who sent them. That's a serious accusation to make about a respected man of this territory. Pratt's mustache twitched. Got proof, Mrs. Prescott? Something past a feeling? I have 2 men who rode onto my land at midnight, Sheriff. One of them dying on my porch as we speak. Dying men don't talk much, in my experience. He crouched to check the wounded man's pulse with 2 fingers, grunted at whatever he found. This one won't see noon, most like. And even if he did men like this, hired men, half don't know who's paying them. Take the coin. Do the work. Ask nothing. So nothing will be done. I'll file a report. Said like the words themselves were an act of great personal generosity. Territory's hard on everybody, ma'am. Especially. A pause. Something calculating moving behind his eyes, especially a woman alone. No offense meant. None taken. Every word of it a lie, and something in her voice must have carried that, because Pratt looked at her properly for the first time since he'd ridden up. Really looked. The same way Garrett had looked at her 11 days before, right before he'd reined his horse back a step. You handled yourself well last night, he said slowly. Real well. Almost professional, way it's laid out here. 2 shots, 2 men down. 1 clean through the shoulder, 1 clean through the heart, and you not so much as scratched. He tilted his head. Where's a farmer's widow learn to shoot like that? Necessity, Sheriff. He didn't believe her. That much was plain enough. But for reasons she couldn't yet understand, he chose not to push it further. Might be wise, Mrs. Prescott. Think hard on Mr. Kane's offer. Save everybody a great deal of trouble. Is that advice, Sheriff? Or a warning? Pratt straightened his hat and didn't answer. He mounted, glanced once more at the dying man, as though belatedly, recalling he ought to do something about him, then rode off toward town without another word. Addie stood alone in the cold morning light and understood, with a clarity that settled into her bones like winter itself, that there was no law out here that would ever help her, not against a man like Kane. There was only whatever she could hold on to herself. She spent the rest of that morning burying the second man herself out past the tree line, where the ground was soft enough to dig without a plow. No marker, no words spoken over him, just the plain, exhausting labor of a woman, making certain no trace of the night's violence lingered any longer than it had to, on land she still meant to call home. By the time she'd finished, her hands ached and her back ached worse, and something in her had gone quiet and hard in a way it hadn't been before. Not cold, exactly, simply resolved. The particular resolve of a person who has just learned, beyond any further doubting, precisely how alone she truly stood. She looked at her own hands again. Steady hands. Her father's hands, really, only wearing her skin. For the first time in 8 years, she didn't push the thought back down. Jem Sutter showed up 3 days later, walking up the north road with everything he owned in a canvas sack over one thin shoulder, wearing a look Addie recognized instantly, because she'd worn that same look once herself, a long time back, on a road, not so different from this one. Hungry, not just for food, for somewhere, anywhere, to belong. Ma'am. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch, cap in hand, maybe 15 or 16, though he carried himself older, the way boys do when life makes them grow up fast, whether they're ready or not. Heard in town you might need help. Fence work. Animals, whatever needs doing. I don't ask much. Meal and someplace dry to sleep. Addie studied him. Thin wrists. A fading bruise along his jaw that told a story he wasn't offering to share. Eyes that kept flicking toward the road behind him, the way a person's eyes do when they expect something to come chasing. She knew that particular fear, too. Know how to work a fence line? Yes, ma'am. Handle animals without spooking them? Yes, ma'am. Keep your mouth shut about what you see and hear on this property? Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Or relief. Like he hadn't expected to be asked something so plainly. Yes, ma'am. Especially that. Addie almost smiled. Almost. Barn's got a loft. Dry and warm enough. Meals come with the work. Same as anybody's. Steal from me, you're gone by sundown. Lie to me, same. Understood? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Name? Jem, ma'am. Jem Sutter. Well, Jem Sutter. She turned back toward the house, then paused, glancing over her shoulder. Things have gotten dangerous around here lately. You ought to know that before you unpack that sack. Jem's chin lifted, just slightly. Something steady settled into his young face that hadn't been there a moment before. I ain't afraid of dangerous, ma'am. Dangerous and me, we're old friends by now. Addie looked at him a long moment. Filed that answer away somewhere. It would matter later, though she couldn't have said why. Not yet. Barn's that way, she said, and went inside to start supper for 2. First time in longer than she cared to count. He proved himself faster than she expected. Up before her most mornings, which was saying something. Mucking the barn and mending fence with a steadiness that didn't match his thin frame at all. He didn't ask questions about the fresh-turned earth near the porch, though he must have noticed it the very first day. Didn't ask why she kept a rifle within reach, even hanging wash on the line. He noticed things, though. Quiet things. The way she flinched, just slightly, at a wagon backfiring on the road 2 days after the burial she still hadn't held for the second man. The way her eyes went to the tree line every time a bird startled up out of the brush. He never once remarked on any of it. Just filed it away, the same careful way she filed things away herself, and went back to work. By the end of the first week, she'd stopped locking the tin box each night. By the end of the second, she'd started leaving the kitchen door unbarred for him past dark, in case he needed anything from the house. Small things. The particular, unhurried currency of 2 guarded people deciding, bit by bit, that the other one could be trusted. The stranger came the following week, on foot, leading a horse gone lame in the off-fore hoof, moving up the same north road Jim had walked before him. Older. Gray shot clean through a beard that hadn't seen a razor in some time. A coat too fine for a drifter and too worn for a gentleman, the way a man looks when he was once one thing and was trying hard now to look like another. Addie watched him come from the porch, rifle within easy reach, the way she watched everyone now. Afternoon, he called. Still a good 30 yards off. Hands visible, deliberately unhurried. Horse threw a shoe 2 days back. We're both about done in. Wondered if I might trouble you for water. For us both. Well's around back, Addie said. Trust's there too. Much obliged. He led the horse toward, and something in the easy, economical way he moved caught her attention. Not old man slow. Careful slow. The kind of careful that only comes from a body that once had to move fast and precise, and trained itself into a stillness that never quite settles all the way down. She'd seen that stillness before, in her father. In her own mirror, some mornings when she forgot to school her posture into something softer. Name's Colquitt, the stranger said. Once the horse was drinking. Ezra Colquitt, passing through toward the Bighorns. Heard there's still color in some of the old creek claims up that way, though I expect that's mostly a young man's dream by now. You don't strike me as a young man, Mr. Colquitt. No, ma'am. Something that might have been a smile moved beneath the gray beard. I don't suppose I do. His eyes moved over the property as he spoke. Not idle-looking, Addie noted. Assessing the fence line, the barn, the fresh-turned earth near the porch where blood had soaked in 11 days before, and grass hadn't yet grown back over it. Had some trouble out here, he said. Not quite a question. Territory's full of trouble, Mr. Colquitt. That it is. He straightened from the trough, patted the lame horse's neck, and looked at her directly, for the first time, and something in that gaze raised the fine hairs along her arms, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Mind if I ask you something, Mrs. Prescott? Mrs. Prescott. He said it slow, turning the name over, testing its weight against something else, entirely something older. That Colt on your hip. Single action army, isn't it? Older piece. Well cared for. Grips worn smooth on the left side, like it's been carried cross-draw for years by somebody left-handed. Addie went very still. I'm right-handed, Mr. Colquitt, I noticed. His eyes didn't move from hers, which is what makes it curious. A right-handed woman carrying a gun worn smooth for a left-handed draw. Man's grip, too, by the size of it. Not made for a lady's hand at all. It was my father's. The words were out before she could stop them, and something cold moved through her the instant she said it, because she never talked about her father. Not to anyone. Not in 8 long years. And here she was handing the fact to a stranger on her own porch like it cost her nothing at all. Ezra Colquitt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that looked for one unguarded moment, almost like grief. Your father teach you to shoot, Mrs. Prescott? I don't see what business. Because I heard talk in town, he said gentle, the way a man approaches a spooked animal, about 2 men found on your porch 11 days back. One shot clean through the shoulder, one clean through the heart, both in the dark, both from a woman. Most folks in Cedar Hollow figured couldn't hardly hold a rifle steady, let alone place 2 shots like that under pressure, at night, with her own life on the line. Addie's hand drifted, unbidden, toward the Colt at her hip. That a threat, Mr. Colquitt? No, ma'am. He shook his head slowly, and for one flicker gone almost before she caught at something itchingly familiar, crossed his weathered face. That's recognition. I saw shooting exactly like that, once before in my life. Long time back. Different territory, different name. His voice dropped, quiet, almost reverent. Man who taught it was about the finest hand with a gun I ever knew, and I knew a great many in my time. Wind moved through the yard between them, stirring dust, stirring something older than dust. Who are you? Addie said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was closer to a demand. Ezra Colquitt studied her a long moment, weighing something, deciding something. Would it trouble you? He asked, instead of answering. If I told you I intend to camp somewhere close by a while longer? This territory's beautiful country. A tired old man and a lame horse might do worse than rest here some days old before moving on. This is my land, Mr. Colquitt. Not a boarding house. No, he agreed, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes. I don't suppose it is, all the same. I expect you'll see me again before too long. Just an old man passing through, he said finally. And the moment, whatever it had been, whatever door had briefly cracked open between them, closed again, quiet and deliberate. Obliged for the water, Mrs. Prescott. I'll trouble you no further today. He led the lame horse back toward road, and Addie stood watching him go, heart hammering in a way it hadn't hammered even with 2 armed men bleeding on her porch 11 nights before, because there had been something in his voice. In the careful, particular way he'd said different name. Like a man who knew exactly what it cost to bury an identity in the ground and build a new one on top of it, brick by careful brick. Like a man who'd done the very same thing himself. She almost called after him. Almost asked the question sitting heavy and desperate in her throat, the one she hadn't let herself ask in 8 years. Because the answer, whatever it turned out to be, felt like it might undo every careful thing she'd built since. She didn't call after him. Not yet. But she watched him walk the north road until he was nothing but a small dark shape against the wide Wyoming sky. And something in her chest, something that had been sleeping even longer than the gunfighter's instinct that had woken 11 nights before stirred, turned over, refused, for the first time in a very long while, to go back to sleep. That night, unable to rest, Addie finally did the thing she'd been avoiding since the day of the funeral. She climbed into the loft above the barn, where Wendell had kept his ledgers and letters, box after box of the ordinary paperwork of an ordinary man's ordinary life, and began, methodically, to go through every single page. Jem found her there past midnight, lantern burning low, papers spread around her in careful stacks. "Ma'am? Everything all right?" "I'm not sure yet, Jem." She didn't look up. "Go on to bed. I won't be much longer." But she was lying, and some part of her already knew it. Because 2 hours later, near the very bottom of a box she'd nearly given up on, her fingers found an envelope that didn't belong with the rest. No postmark, no return address. Just her husband's careful handwriting on the front, and inside, folded 3 times over, a survey map she'd never once seen before. A survey map of her own land, dated the previous winter, marked in red ink along a line that ran straight through the heart of the Prescott property, through the creek, through the good bottom ground Wendell had loved so much he'd staked his whole life on it. She spread it flat on the floorboards and studied it a long while, trying to make sense of the careful markings, the elevation notes penciled small along the margins, the surveyor's stamp in the corner belonging to a company name she'd never once heard mentioned in Cedar Hollow. Wendell had never surveyed anything in his life beyond the boundaries of his own fields. Wherever this map had come from, it hadn't come from any tool he'd owned or any skill he'd possessed, which meant somebody had given it to him. Which meant Wendell had gone looking for something, or somebody had come looking for Wendell sometime in the months before his death, and neither possibility sat easy in Addie's chest. At the bottom of the map, in a different hand than Wendell's, 3 words were written that made the blood run cold and slow in Addie's veins. Confirmed. Proceed carefully. She sat very still in the lantern light, wind moving, soft and endless across the dark Wyoming plain outside, understanding with a certainty that settled deep into her bones that her husband's death had not been any accident at all, and that whatever he'd found here, on this ordinary, unremarkable stretch of ground she'd called home for 8 quiet years, was coming looking for her too. Somewhere out past the dark tree line, a horse nickered softly in the cold night air, watching, waiting. The story was only just beginning. Grief and suspicion, Addie was learning, made poor companions for sleep. The letter sat on the kitchen table 3 full days before Addie could make herself touch it again. She'd read it 100 times already, knew every word by heart. Confirmed. Proceed carefully. 4 words in a stranger's hand, and somehow, those 4 words had rewritten everything she thought she knew about her husband's death. Because a fall from a horse doesn't come with instructions. Because a patch of ice doesn't leave notes behind for anybody to find. Which meant somebody else had left that map among Wendell's things. Somebody who knew exactly what he'd found. Somebody who'd wanted him to keep looking, keep digging, keep pulling at a thread that eventually got him killed for the pulling. She sat with her coffee, gone cold in front of her, staring at nothing, mind circling the same 3 words like a wolf, circling a fire. It couldn't quite bring itself to approach. Confirmed. Proceed carefully. He hadn't. Or maybe he had. And it hadn't been careful enough. Either way, the man was dead, and the only voice left to answer her questions belonged to a piece of paper that couldn't talk back, no matter how long she stared at it. She found herself in those 3 long days, revisiting every ordinary memory of Wendell's final months, with new and unwelcome suspicion. The evenings he'd claimed to be checking fence along the East Ridge, gone longer than fence checking usually took. The letters he'd sometimes received from Cheyenne that he'd never once mentioned the contents of, tucking them away in his coat before she'd properly seen the return address. Small things, unremarkable at the time, that now sat heavy with a meaning she'd never once suspected while he was alive to explain them. She wished, with a fierceness that surprised her, that she'd asked more questions back then. Wished she'd pressed him gently about whatever had been sitting on his mind those final weeks. Grief was cruel enough on its own. Grief laced through with guilt over questions, never asked, cut a good deal deeper. "Ma'am?" Jem's voice from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. That bothered her more than it should have. A woman who couldn't hear a boy's boots on her own porch was a woman who'd let her guard slip somewhere she couldn't afford to let it. "You've been sitting there since before sunup," Jem said. "Coffee's gone cold twice now. Made a fresh pot." "I'm fine, Jem." "No, ma'am. You ain't." He set the fresh cup down anyway. Careful, like he was handling something breakable. "Whatever's in that letter's been eating at you 3 days straight. Man'd have to be blind not to see it." Addie looked up at him. 16 years old, maybe, thin as a fence rail, and already sharper about people than most grown men she'd ever known. "It's nothing you need to worry over." "Didn't ask if I needed to," said I already was. Something steady crossed his young face, older by a wide margin than his years. "You took me in when you didn't have to. Feed me. Work me fair. Ask nothing but honest labor in return. Whatever's coming for you, ma'am, it's coming for this place too. My place now. Long as you'll have me." Something tightened in Addie's throat that she hadn't expected. She looked away, out the window, toward the barn, toward the loft, where she'd spent half a night going through a dead man's papers by lantern light. "My husband didn't die by accident, Jim." The words came out flat, final, like setting down something heavy she'd carried too long already. Jim didn't flinch, didn't gasp or press a hand to his chest the way half the women in town would have. He just nodded, slow, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. "Figured as much," he said. "Ma'am, can I tell you something? Something I ain't told a living soul." "Go on." "I didn't just wander into Cedar Hollow by accident either." His hands twisted together on the table, restless, was working a spread 2 counties over. "Saw men come and go I shouldn't have seen. Heard things I wasn't meant to hear. Men connected to Silas Kane's business, though I couldn't rightly say how far up that business went. Had to leave quick, or leave in a box." He looked at her. "I think whatever your husband found, ma'am, I think it's bigger than just your land." Addie went very still. "How much bigger?" "Don't rightly know for certain, but there's talk. Railroad men passing through quiet like. Survey crews out past the bighorns that ain't supposed to be there yet, by any schedule I ever heard of." He shook his head. "Something's coming through this territory, ma'am. Something big. I think your husband found out what it was before somebody made certain sure he'd never get the chance to tell anybody." The coffee sat forgotten between them, going cold a third time. Outside, wind picked up, moving through dry grass with a sound like something exhaling long and slow. She found Ezra Colquitt exactly where she expected to, which was nowhere near where he'd claimed he was headed. 3 miles east of her property line, camped in a hollow beside a dry creek bed, his lame horse hobbled and grazing, a small fire burning low against the evening chill. He didn't look surprised when she rode up. Didn't reach for a weapon either, and that told her something plain about the kind of man he was. Because most drifters would have come up shooting first and asked questions. Never. "Mrs. Prescott." He didn't look away from the fire. "Wondered how long it'd take you. You lied to me, did I?" He turned finally, and his eyes in the firelight looked older than they had on her porch, tired in a way that went bone deep. "Seems to me I said I was an old man passing through." "Still true, last I checked. You said you were headed for the bighorns." Chasing color in the old claims. Addie dismounted. Didn't tie off her horse. Kept it close, hand loose, and ready near her hip the way her father had taught her a lifetime ago. "That was 3 days back. You're still sitting 3 miles from my front door." Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his weathered face. "Might have been something sadder. Guilty," he said. "Sit down, Mrs. Prescott. Or don't. Your choice entirely. But I expect you've got questions. I expect I owe you some answers. And I expect this conversation's a long time coming. One way or another." Addie sat across the small fire, rifle across her knees, because trust was something she'd learned long ago to ration carefully. "Who are you?" Same question she'd asked on her porch. Same question that had gone unanswered. Ezra looked into the fire a long moment before he spoke. "I knew your father," he said finally. "Long time ago. Before Wyoming. Before any of this." His eyes came up to meet hers, and something in them made her chest go tight and cold, all at once. Before you, if I'm being fully honest. Before you were anything but a notion your mother carried. The fire popped, a log shifting, settling. That's not possible, isn't it? My father's dead. 12 years now. The words came out sharper than she meant them, defensive. The way a person sounds when the ground beneath them starts shifting without asking permission. First, he died in Montana. I was 14. Is that what you believe? It's what happened, Mrs. Prescott. His voice had gone gentle now, gentle in a way that frightened her worse than any threat could have managed. What's your father's name? The one you remember? The one carved into whatever stone marks whatever grave you were told to believe in? Something cold moved down Addie's spine. Why does it matter? Because I think you already know why. Ezra leaned forward, firelight carving deep shadows into his weathered face. Because I think some part of you has known since the very moment you saw this face on your porch step. I think that's exactly why you're sitting here right now, 3 miles from your own front door, asking an old drifter questions you've been afraid to ask yourself for 12 long years. Addie's hands tightened on the rifle. Her breath came shallow. Don't, she said. Don't you dare say Adeline. The name came out of him soft, broken, like it had been sitting in his mouth for over a decade, waiting for permission to exist again. My Addie girl. Watch the hands, not the eyes. The words hit her like a physical blow, because those were his words, her father's words. The exact phrase from her dream. The exact phrase she'd never once spoken aloud to another living soul in 8 years in this territory. The exact phrase that had lived only in her memory, and in the tin box beneath her floorboard, and in the worn grip of a Colt she'd carried out of Montana at 18 years old. No, she said, voice smaller than she wanted. No, that's you can't. I can. And I did. Teach you that, I mean. Kitchen table. Gun oil on the rags. You were 13 going on 14, and too young by half, but there wasn't any choosing otherwise. Not with what was already coming for us. His voice cracked just slightly, just enough to hear years of grief threaded clean through it. I've thought about that kitchen table every single day since. Every single day, Addie, for 12 straight years. Addie was on her feet before she knew she'd moved, rifle raised, hands shaking now, finally shaking, after 2 dead men on her own porch hadn't managed to rattle her once. You're lying. I'm not. He died. I buried him. I stood right at that grave and You stood at an empty box, Adeline. 6 feet of Montana dirt over nothing but rocks, and a coat I left behind on purpose. Because a man being hunted by the kind of people hunting me doesn't get to simply disappear. He has to die. Properly. Publicly. With witnesses, and grief, and a stone with a name carved on it, so the men looking for him finally stopped looking. His eyes had gone wet, and he made no move to hide it. I had one single night to decide, Addie girl. One night. Run with you and your mother, and keep the both of you hunted the rest of your lives. Or die where the whole town could see it, and let you both go free. You left us. I saved you. You let me bury an empty box. Grieve a man who was still breathing somewhere while Her voice broke entirely now, rifle wavering. While I grew up believing I was alone in this world. While Mama died 3 years after, still believing you were gone. While I married a good man and built an entire life on a lie you handed me. And you just what? Watched? From a distance? All this time? Not the whole time. Montana first, hiding in a mining camp so rough. Nobody thought to look for a lawman among the drunkards and the desperate. Nevada after, breaking horses for a rancher who never once asked my real name. Ezra stood too now, slow, hands open at his sides, offering nothing that could be mistaken for a threat. 2 years working railroad security in the Dakota Territory under a different name entirely after that, which was its own particular kind of bitter irony, guarding the very interests I'd once refused to serve, because a man on the run takes whatever work, asks no questions. I buried myself in labor those years, Addie. Told myself the labor was penance. Some mornings I even believed it. But I kept track of you, Addie. Every year. Every move you made. Knew when you married. Knew when Wendell died, and I came the moment word reached me, because I already suspected it wasn't the plain accident, the sheriff called it. Because what? Because the men I ran from 12 years ago. His jaw tightened. I believe they've finally caught up to this family again. And I believe your husband died on account of ground you're standing on right now. Ground that sits square in the middle of something those men have wanted very badly for a very long time. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere out in the dark, A coyote called, thin and lonesome across the empty land. Addie lowered the rifle, slowly. Her whole body felt hollowed out, scraped clean, the particular way a person feels once a fever finally breaks. "Who are they?" she said. "The men. The ones who came after us. The ones who might have killed Wendell." Ezra Colquitt's face hardened in the firelight. Old grief hardening into something colder. Something that looked, for one terrible moment, exactly like the look she'd worn 11 nights before, standing over 2 dead men on her own porch. "That," he said quietly, "is a story that starts a long time before you were even born. Addie girl. And it doesn't end well for anybody who steps in its way." They talked until the fire burned to embers. Addie learned things that night that rearranged the entire architecture of who she'd believed herself to be. Her father's real name hadn't been Colquitt in 12 years. She learned he'd once served as a deputy United States Marshal out of Montana Territory, that he'd built a reputation as one of the fastest, most precise hands with a gun west of the Mississippi, and that reputation had made him valuable to certain men in certain positions of power who wanted violence done quietly, deniably, without the law's fingerprints anywhere on it. He'd refused them. Once. Then again. Then a third time, when the job on offer involved a rancher's entire family standing between a railroad and its right-of-way, and he'd refused so completely, he'd arrested the man doing the asking. That man had friends. Powerful ones. Railroad money threaded up through territorial politics all the way to state houses and further still. Ezra told her about the night itself. Finally, because she asked, because some part of her needed the whole shape of it laid bare, even as another part of her dreaded every word. There had been a cabin outside a Montana mining camp. A hard freeze coming down off the peaks early that year, same as the wolves the mercantile owner's wife would one day warn Addie about. A lifetime later and a lifetime removed. There had been 2 men waiting in the trees. When Ezra rode up that final evening, men he recognized from 3 separate ambushes survived over the preceding months. Men sent by the same interests he'd crossed by refusing their money and arresting their errand boy. He'd known, riding in, that the night wouldn't end with all 3 of them walking away from it. He'd made his choice before he ever swung down off the horse. A choice made faster than choices like that ought to be made, and carried heavier than any choice he'd made before or since. He'd let them see him, let the gunfight happen loud enough for half the camp to hear it, and end with a body left burning in a structure fire, lit from an overturned lamp, a body wearing his coat, his boots, close enough in size and shape that nobody looking at charred remains by lantern light would ever think to doubt it. The real fight, the quiet one, the one that mattered, had happened an hour earlier and 3 miles distant, in the barn where his wife and daughter were meant to be sleeping, where instead they were already saddling horses in the dark on his whispered instruction, already riding hard for a stage line that would carry them somewhere. His enemies had never thought to look. He'd stood at the edge of that mining camp 2 days later, in a borrowed coat and a false name, and watched from a respectful distance as a small crowd gathered around a marked grave that held nothing of him at all. Watched a young widow, his own wife, though nobody there recognized her through the veil, accept condolences from men who'd very nearly killed her husband themselves. Watched a girl of 14 stand rigid and dry-eyed beside her mother, too young to understand. Yet that dry-eyed wasn't the same thing as unbroken. He'd wanted, more than he'd ever wanted anything, to walk across that frozen ground and take his daughter's hand. He hadn't, because taking her hand would have undone every single thing the lie was meant to protect. He'd stood there, instead, hat pulled low, until the small crowd finally dispersed back toward the warmth of their own homes. And only then had he allowed himself to walk away in the opposite direction entirely, toward whatever life a dead man was permitted to build for himself. "I watched you not cry," he told Addie now, voice raw in a way it hadn't been all night. "Watched you stand there, straight as a fence post, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction. And I thought even then, Addie girl, even grieving my own funeral from 30 yards off, I thought, there she is. There's exactly the woman I hoped she'd grow up to be." "I wasn't strong," Addie said, throat tight. "I was numb. There's a difference. I know that now," Ezra said quietly. "Took me the better part of 12 years to learn it. I'm sorry it took so long." They sat quiet a while. After that, the fire burning lower, before Addie found the courage to ask the question that had been sitting heaviest in her chest all evening. Did she know? Mama, did she know you were alive all those years? Or did she die still believing the same lie I did? Something in Ezra's face went very still. She knew, he said quietly. I sent word, careful as I could manage. Once I judged enough time had passed that the risk had settled some. A single unsigned, that only she'd have understood the meaning of. She never wrote back. I always believed that was her choosing to protect you both, keeping no evidence of contact that might have led anybody back to either of us. But I never knew for certain whether she forgave me for it, or only endured it, the way a person endures weather. She never spoke of you, Addie said. Not once. In all the years after. I used to think that meant the grief was too big to touch. Now I wonder if it meant something else instead. Maybe both, Ezra said. Grief and quiet fury aren't so different, in the end. I'd imagine your mother carried plenty of each on my account. He looked into the fire a long moment. I loved her a great deal, Addie girl, whatever else you might believe of me. Losing the chance to tell her so again is a debt. I'll be carrying the rest of my days, same as I carry the rest. Addie reached across the small space between them and, for the first time since she was a girl of 13 at a kitchen table, took her father's hand. Neither of them said anything further about it. Some grief doesn't need more words laid on top of it. It only needs finally to be shared instead of carried alone. I don't know precisely how much of it there is to know. Still, Ezra admitted, staring into the coals. Only that Kane isn't the top of it. Kane's a local instrument. Useful. Respected enough that his offers pass for legitimate. But Kane doesn't have the reach behind this on his own. Somebody moves him. And every road I've followed since I got here just leads to another closed door. Then we find who's behind the door. Ezra looked at her, firelight throwing deep lines across his weathered face, and something moved behind his eyes, equal parts pride and terror. That's your father talking, he said quietly. God help the both of us. That's near enough what I said myself, years back, right before it all went to hell. Maybe it goes different this time. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced of it. Or maybe certain things simply repeat themselves, generation over generation, till somebody finally has the sense to walk clean away. You never walked away. No, Ezra admitted. And look what it cost me. I'd not wish that particular cost on you, Addie girl. Whatever pride I might also feel in watching you carry the same fire I once did. Maybe the fire's worth the cost. Maybe that's simply the price of being the kind of person who can't stand by while wrong goes unanswered. Ezra studied her a long moment, something equal parts grief and admiration moving behind his tired eyes. Addie stood brushing dust from her skirt, rifle back in the crook of her arm where it belonged. I'm not walking away from my own home, Papa. The word slipped out before she decided to say it. Papa! 12 years unused, and it came out soft and unpracticed, like a language she'd nearly forgotten how to speak. Ezra Colquitt's face crumpled, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see the whole weight of those lost years pass across it. No, he said, voice thick. I don't suppose you are. She didn't sleep at all that night, back in her own bed, staring at the same ceiling she'd stared at 100 times since Wendell died. Except this time the thoughts circling weren't only grief, because her father was alive, because the man she'd mourned twice over, once as a girl in Montana, once more quietly, every single year since, on the date she'd never told a soul, she still privately marked had been breathing this whole time, 3 states and a dozen years away, thinking of her, watching from whatever careful distance kept them both alive, which meant every ordinary thing about her ordinary life had a second layer underneath it she'd never once suspected. Her wedding day. Wendell's proposal, delivered awkward and earnest, by the creek he'd loved so well. The birth of nothing, because there'd been no children, though they'd hoped, quietly, in the early years, before hoping had started to feel like its own kind of grief. Her father had known about all of it, had watched from wherever he watched from, unable to send so much as a letter, unable to stand beside her at the one wedding she'd ever have, unable to grieve openly at the one funeral that mattered most, until this year finally forced his hand. She lay there a long while, turning the whole shape of it over, and somewhere near dawn, exhausted past the point of further tears, she made a decision that felt less like choosing and more like simply admitting what had already been decided to. The moment Ezra Colquitt said her true name aloud beside that dying fire. She was done being careful. Careful hadn't saved Wendell. Careful hadn't stopped two men from breaking her own front door in the dark. Whatever came next, she intended to meet it the way her father had raised her to meet things, before the world convinced her that raising had been a mistake. Sheriff Amos Pratt's office sat on the corner of Cedar Hollow's single-reel street, wedged between the Mercantile and a saloon that did considerably better business than either. Addie had avoided it since the morning he'd stood over a dying man on her porch and called it a mess, like violence visited on her own home was some minor inconvenience to his afternoon. She went there 3 days after the fire, after the confessions, after her whole understanding of herself had been quietly rebuilt from the ground up. Pratt looked up from his desk when she came in, and something crossed his face too quick to name before he covered it with his usual folksy smile. "Mrs. Prescott, wasn't expecting you. I imagine not. What can I do for you? You can tell me why the report on the men who attacked my home 11 nights back was never filed." The smile faltered. "Just slightly. Just enough. Filed it myself, ma'am. Sent it up the Territorial. I checked, Sheriff." Addie kept her voice level, though her heart was hammering plenty. "Rode into Buffalo 3 days back and asked the Territorial clerk directly. No report from Cedar Hollow this month. Not one. Must be some clerical error along the—" "Stop lying to me." The words came out sharp enough to cut, and Pratt actually flinched. And in that flinch, Addie saw everything she needed to see. Everything Ezra had suspected. Everything her own gut had been whispering for weeks now. "I don't know what you think you know, Mrs. Prescott, but I know Silas Kane pays you." She stepped closer to the desk, and Pratt, big as he was, leaned back in his chair like she carried more danger than her size suggested. Which, by now, she supposed she did. "I know that's why nothing gets investigated out at my place. Why the men who broke into my home walked free of any consequence past a bullet. Why you keep telling me, over and over, how wise it would be to simply sell. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation, Sheriff, backed by a pattern anybody with eyes could see if they cared to look for it." Her voice dropped, quiet and cold. "How much does he pay you?" "To look away while men die on my porch. While my husband—" She stopped herself, caught the words before they went further than she'd meant. But Pratt's face had already changed. Gone pale, then careful, then something close to fear. "Your husband's death was an accident," he said. "Too fat, too certain. Ruled that way by the county coroner. Proper and legal. Did you order that ruling, Sheriff? Or did somebody order it for you? I don't have to sit here and answer questions like that." "No," Addie agreed. "You don't. But the Territorial Marshal's office might feel differently once I've finished telling them everything I know. And I expect a man in your position understands better than most how quickly a proper and legal ruling can come unraveled once somebody with real authority starts pulling at the right thread." Pratt's hands, resting on the desk, had curled slowly into fists, not threatening. Frightened, if she read it right. The particular stillness of a man doing frantic arithmetic behind an otherwise calm face. "You don't know what you're stirring up, Mrs. Prescott." "I know exactly what I'm stirring up, Sheriff. That's precisely why I'm here, instead of simply riding away and letting the whole rotten business lie." Silence stretched long and taut between them. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the street. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary town that had no notion, Addie thought. How much rot sat quiet behind its sheriff's badge. "You should go home, Mrs. Prescott," Pratt said finally, voice low. "Go home. Think real hard on Mr. Kane's offer. Stop asking questions liable to get you exactly what your husband got." The threat sat there, plain and ugly, finally spoken instead of only implied. Addie held his gaze a long moment, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Let him see clearly that whatever fear he'd been counting on hadn't taken root at all. "Thank you for your candor, Sheriff," she said, and walked out with her spine straight and her hands steady, though her heart pounded loud enough to hear in her own ears. She had her confirmation now. The law in Cedar Hollow wasn't going to help her, which meant whatever came next, she'd have to answer it herself. Word of her visit reached Kane's study before supper. He listened to Pratt's account without interrupting, standing at his window with a glass of good whiskey he never once touched, watching the last light drain out of the sky over the bee horns. "She knows," Pratt said, twisting his hat in his hands like a nervous schoolboy instead of a lawman with a badge and a gun. "About the money. About the report. Said it plain. Right to my face. Did she have proof?" "Not that," she said. But she didn't need it, Mr. Kane. Not the way she looked at me. Woman's got a mind like a bear trap. Once she's decided something's true, she doesn't let it go. Kane finally turned from the window. Anything else? Pratt hesitated. Talk of a stranger camped near her property. Older man. Been seen coming and going 3-4 times this past week. A suitor? Don't think so. Way she looks at him. Way he looks at her. It's something older than that. My deputy thought he heard her call the man Papa, out past the mercantile, though he might have misheard at that distance. Kane went very still. Her father, he said slowly, is dead. Has been for over a decade. Montana, I believe, well before she ever came to this territory. That's what everybody's always understood, sir. Get me a description of this stranger, as detailed as you can manage. Kane set his whiskey down on the windowsill, hard enough that a little sloshed over the rim. And Pratt, understand something clearly. If that woman has real proof connecting me to what happened on her property, or worse, connecting either of us to what happened to her husband, this stops being a simple land matter. This becomes something else entirely. Garrett had been standing near the door, the whole while, silent, hat still in his hands from delivering an unrelated report on stock counts. He shifted now, uneasy. Mr. Kane, if I might. What is it, Garrett? I signed on to run cattle. Push a hard bargain. Maybe rough up a fence or two if a dispute called for it. I didn't sign on for what this is turning into. He set his hat down slow, deliberate, like a man setting down something he no longer wanted in his hands at all. Whatever you're about to do next, I'd as soon not be part of the doing. Kane studied him a long, cold moment. Then draw your final wages from the foreman's box and be gone from my land by morning, he said. Without heat, without anger, the particular flatness of a man for whom loyalties had never once outweighed convenience. I've no use for a man who loses his nerve at the exact moment I need him steadiest. Garrett nodded once, and left without another word, and whatever came of Silas Kane's ranch after that night, Garrett wasn't there to see the worst of it. He rode out before sunup, north, toward a life that didn't require him to look away from things a decent man oughtn't look away from. He never returned to Cedar Hollow, so far as anybody there ever learned, though word reached the territory eventually that a man matching his description had taken up honest ranch work 2 counties over and seemed, by every account, considerably more at peace with himself than he'd looked riding out that final morning. Kane watched him go from the same window, expression unreadable, and turned back to Pratt as though the whole exchange had cost him nothing at all. What do you want me to do? Pratt asked. Kane looked out at the darkening byhorns a long moment before answering. I want you to send word to Reese Colton. Pratt's face went pale. Mr. Kane, Colton's men aren't like the ones we sent before. They don't scare easy, and they don't work halfway. Bring Colton into this. I'm well aware what Colton's men are, Sheriff. That's precisely why I'm bringing them in. Kane's voice had gone flat, cold, all pretense of gentlemanly patience finally stripped clean away. This woman has cost me weeks of delay on a project certain very powerful interests are growing impatient about. I am done being patient myself. And if she doesn't have proof, if we're stirring up a hornet's nest over nothing at all, then we'll have spent a little money buying certainty. Kane picked his whiskey back up, finally drank, and his eyes, when he looked at Pratt, held nothing kind in them at all. Send the word tonight. Reese Colton arrived in Cedar Hollow 2 days later, and the whole town seemed to feel it before anybody actually saw him. A silence moved through the street like weather. Shopkeepers found sudden reasons to step inside. Dogs went quiet mid-bark. He was younger than most men in his line of work, 35 perhaps, lean and economical in his movements, the way certain predators move economical. Never wasting effort, never showing more than the moment required. 3 riders came in behind him, hard-eyed men who didn't speak because they never needed to. Inside the saloon, once the 4 of them had passed on through, toward the Kane Road, an old cattle hand who'd worked 3 territories in his time, set down his glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady. That's Reese Colton, he said, to nobody in particular, though every man at the bar leaned in to hear it anyway. Rode with him once, years back, down in the Nations. Man doesn't bluff, doesn't threaten twice. First time's the only warning anybody ever gets. Heard he burned out a whole settlement in Kansas. Somebody offered. Women and children included, on account of one rancher's stubbornness. Heard plenty of things, the old hand said. staring at his empty glass like it might refill itself out of sheer discomfort. Don't know how many of them's true. Only know I never once saw a man cross him and live long enough to regret it proper. Whatever exaggeration had crept into the telling over the years, the plain truth beneath it needed no embellishing at all. A man like Colton didn't get hired for negotiation. He got hired for endings. He went straight to the Kane Ranch. Didn't stop at the sheriff's office. Didn't stop for supplies. A man who'd clearly ridden this exact road on this exact business plenty of times already, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise now. You said this was simple, Colton said, settling into a chair without being invited to. A widow. Some land. Should have been finished a month back. The widow's proven more complicated than expected. Complicated. Colton's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. Complicated is 2 of your men dead on a porch in the dark. That what you mean? Word travels fast, Mr. Kane. When a lone woman puts down 2 armed men before either gets off a shot, she had help, or training. We don't yet know which. Doesn't much matter which, does it? Dead is dead. Colton leaned back, studying Kane with open calculation. You want this handled quiet or handled permanent? I want it handled entirely. Kane's jaw tightened. There's also a man. Older. Drifting through. Been seen at her property multiple times this past week. Possibly connected to her in ways we don't yet understand. I want him identified. And I want to know precisely what proof, if any, she's gathered against Sheriff Pratt and myself. And if she won't give it up easy? Kane didn't answer directly. Just looked at Colton a long, steady moment, and Colton, reading whatever answer sat unspoken in that look, finally did smile. Thin and cold. I'll find something she cares about, he said. There's always something. A person, usually. Easier to move a woman with a person than with threats to herself. Women like that, the hard ones, the ones who don't scare for their own sake, they've generally got exactly one soft spot left. Find it, and the rest takes care of itself. Kane's expression didn't change, though something in his silence felt, even to himself, like a door quietly closing on whatever conscience he'd once claimed to carry. There's a boy, he said finally. Works her land. 16, maybe 17. She took him in a few weeks back. Colton's smile widened, just slightly. There it is, he said. There's always a boy. He stood, rolling his wounded shoulder loose, already thinking 3 moves ahead in the particular unhurried way of a man who'd done this precise calculation dozens of times before across a dozen other territories. I'll want 2 days to study her property proper before I move. Learn her habits. Learn who comes and goes, and when. Rushed work is sloppy work, Mr. Kane. And sloppy work is how a man like your Garrett ends up dead on a porch. He never should have approached in the dark. Take whatever time you require. Only understand that my patience, and the patience of the men I answer to, is not without its own limit. Nobody's patience ever is. Colton settled his hat back onto his head, unhurried, final. I'll send word once it's finished. Try not to lose your nerve in the meanwhile, Mr. Kane. Men who lose their nerve halfway through tend to make considerably worse decisions than the ones who simply see a thing through. He left the study without waiting to be dismissed, and Kane stood alone a long while after, staring at the same darkening view of the bighorns that had witnessed every decision he'd made in this whole ugly business, wondering, not for the first time, exactly when he'd traded whatever conscience he'd once carried for a ledger full of numbers that no longer felt like they belonged to him at all. Addie didn't know any of this, of course. Couldn't know it. Not yet. Not the way the story was unfolding in rooms she'd never enter, among men whose faces she wouldn't see until it was already too late. What she knew was this. Her father was alive, camped 3 miles from her door, teaching her again, slow and careful, the things he'd taught her at 13 and 8 years of ordinary farm living had let go soft and rusty in her hands. They practiced together in the early mornings, before Jem woke, before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Draw and fire. Draw and fire. Her father's voice, low and patient, correcting her stance, her grip, the angle of her elbow. You're rushing, he told her, on the 4th morning, watching her holster and draw for perhaps the 40th time. Speed comes after precision, Addie girl. Not before. A fast shot that misses is worse than a slow one that doesn't. Wendell used to say something like that, about fence posts. Wendell sounds like he understood more than most men manage. Something softened in Ezra's weathered face. Sorry, I never got the chance to meet him. He would have liked you. Addie reset her stance. Drew again, slower this time, and the shot rang clean and true into the fence post. They'd set 30 yards off. Or hated you for what you did to me. Hard to say which. Both most likely. Ezra's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Most complicated things are both. They fell into an easy silence. After that, the kind that only exists between people who've stopped needing every moment filled with words. Addie drew and fired, each shot finding its mark a little cleaner than the one before. Something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 8 long years beginning, slowly, to loosen. On the 5th morning, Ezra taught her to read a man's shoulders before his hand ever moved for a weapon. On the 6th, he had her draw blindfolded, trusting her body to remember what her eyes couldn't confirm until she could find the grip and clear the holster in the same clean motion without once needing to look down. On the 7th, Jim asked, shy and hopeful, whether he might learn something too, and Ezra taught him instead to read a room from its doorway, to count exits before he counted faces, the quieter kind of survival that didn't need a gun at all. Not everybody's built to be fast with a Colt, Ezra told the boy, not unkindly. But everybody can learn to see trouble coming before it arrives. That skill saved more lives than any quick draw ever has. Jim took to it with the same fierce, grateful attention he brought to everything Addie asked of him, and by the 8th morning he could name, without looking twice, which fence posts offered cover and which stretch of the yard left a person exposed on every side. Small lessons. The kind that wouldn't matter, Addie told herself, unless the worst came calling. That same evening, once Ezra had retired to his camp and the chores were finally finished, Jim lingered on the porch step longer than usual, turning something over in his hands that Addie recognized, after a moment, as one of Wendell's old carving tools. Found it in the barn, he said, not quite looking at her. Hope that's all right. Was thinking I might whittle something. Evenings. If there's no objection. No objection at all. She sat down beside him, the wood of the step still warm from the day's sun. Wendell used to whittle. Some winters. Never finished half of what he started. What'd he make? Little animals, mostly. Horses. A fox once. That came out looking more like a dog, no matter how many times he tried again. She smiled, the memory arriving softer than she expected. I kept every one of them. They're on the shelf by the hearth, if you ever want to see. Jim was quiet a moment, turning the carving tool over in his thin fingers. I never had nobody keep things I made, he said finally. Not before here, well. Addie's voice came out gentler than she'd planned. You do now. He ducked his head at that. The same shy, grateful gesture she was coming to recognize as entirely his own, and said nothing further, and needed to say nothing further, because some understandings settle into a person quietly, without requiring more words laid on top of them. She should have known better than to believe those small lessons wouldn't matter, because by then the worst was already riding toward them, and had been for days, until Jim's voice broke across the yard, urgent, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. Ma'am! Riders coming up the south road. 4 of them, moving fast. Addie's blood went cold. Because 4 riders moving fast, on a morning when Ezra had just finished telling her about a man named Colton, whose reputation preceded him across 3 territories. 4 riders like that meant exactly one thing, and every instinct in her body, old instinct, inherited instinct, screamed at her to move. Jim, get inside now. Ma'am, I can help. I've got the shotgun. I can now, Jim. But it was already too late. The riders came up fast and hard, dust boiling behind them, and Addie recognized the man at the front instantly, without ever once having seen him before, because there was something about the way he sat his horse, economical, predatory, that told her precisely who and what he was. Reese Colton reined in at the edge of the yard, his 3 riders fanning out behind him, eyes moving over the scene with cold, unhurried assessment. The woman with the Colt still smoking faintly from the fence post, the gray-bearded old man beside her, hand drifting instinctively toward his own weapon. The boy frozen halfway between house and barn, shotgun raised but shaking badly in his thin hands. His 3 men spread wide across the yard with the practiced ease of hired guns who'd dubbed this exact maneuver on a dozen other frightened households before this one. One young, barely past 20, with the particular hungry look of a man still trying to prove himself worthy of Colton's reputation. 2 older, weathered, moving with the flat, uninterested calm of men for whom violence had long ago stopped meaning anything at all beyond a day's wage. Mrs. Prescott. Colton's voice was pleasant, almost warm, the kind of warmth that raised the hair on Addie's arms. Heard a great deal about you these past few days. Didn't quite believe half of it. You're trespassing. I am. He didn't dismount. Didn't reach for a weapon either. Not yet. Though his hand rested easy near his hip in a way that told her he could, faster than she'd like. Come to deliver a message. From Mr. Kane. Kane can deliver his own messages. Mr. Kane's grown weary of asking politely. Colton's eyes drifted, deliberate, toward Jim, toward the boy's shaking hands and frightened eyes, and something in that look made Addie's stomach drop straight through the floor. You've caused a considerable amount of trouble, Mrs. Prescott. 2 dead men. A sheriff you've accused publicly of taking bribes. Questions asked in Buffalo about missing reports. All of it terribly inconvenient for terribly powerful people. Whatever business you've got, it's with her, Ezra said, stepping half a pace forward, voice low, and even in a way that carried its own particular warning. Not the boy. Colton's gaze slid toward him, unhurried, assessing, the way a man studies a stranger he hasn't yet decided is worth the bother of remembering. Old man's got some fight left in him, he said, almost admiring. We'll see how much before this business is through. So kill me and be done with it, Addie said, voice steady though her heart hammered. Same as you did, my husband. Something flickered across Colton's face at that. Quick and gone. But Ezra beside her caught it too, and his whole body went rigid. Your husband's death, Colton said carefully, was handled by other parties. Before my involvement. I deal only in what's necessary going forward. His eyes drifted back to Jem, deliberate and cold. And going forward, Mrs. Prescott, I think you'll find you're a good deal more reasonable. Once you've got something real to lose. Everything happened very fast after that. 2 of Colton's riders broke from the group, spurring hard toward Jim, and the boy raised the shotgun, hands shaking too badly to aim true, and Addie was already moving, already firing, already screaming his name across the yard, even as she understood, with sick certainty, that she wasn't fast enough, wasn't close enough. That 4 riders against 1 woman and an old man and a terrified boy was math that didn't favor them, however good her aim had grown in a handful of short mornings' practice. 1 rider went down under her first shot. Ezra's gun spoke twice beside her, and a second man cried out and slumped hard in the saddle. But it wasn't enough, because a 3rd rider had circled wide, unnoticed in the chaos, and came up behind Jim from the blind side, and the boy's shotgun went off wild into empty sky as a rope looped tight around his shoulders and yanked him backward off his feet. Jem, Addie ran, rifle raised, but Colton's own gun was already leveled at her, steady and unhurried, his voice cutting across the yard, cold and final. Drop it, Mrs. Prescott. Right now. Or the boy dies here in your yard and you watch every second of it. Addie froze, rifle still raised. Every instinct screaming to fire, to fight, to do anything at all rather than stand there helpless, while a boy she'd taken in off the road, a boy who'd asked for nothing but a meal and someplace dry to sleep, was dragged struggling toward a waiting horse. Ma'am! Jim's voice, terrified, cracking. Don't drop it! Don't let them! A gloved hand cracked hard across his face, silencing him mid-word. Drop it, Colton said again, quieter now, which somehow made it worse. You've got 3 seconds, Mrs. Prescott, and I promise you, I've done this exact thing before, and I've never once needed a 4th. Addie's hands were shaking now, really shaking, for the first time since 2 dead men had bled out on her porch. She looked at Jim, bound and bleeding from a split lip, looked at Ezra beside her, face gone gray and desperate in a way that told her he understood, better than she did, exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Addie? Low, urgent? Do it. Drop it. Her rifle hit the dirt. Colton smiled, thin and satisfied, holstering his own weapon with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never once doubted the outcome. Wise, he said. Very wise. He gestured, and his surviving rider hauled Jem up onto a spare horse, the boy still struggling weakly against the ropes binding his wrists. You've got until tomorrow sundown. Bring whatever proof you've gathered against Mr. Kane and the good sheriff. Sign the land over, clean and legal. No more delays. Do that, and the boy goes free, unharmed. And if I don't, Colton's smile didn't waver. Then I expect you already know the answer to that, Mrs. Prescott. You strike me as a woman who understands consequences better than most. He wheeled his horse, his surviving rider following with Jem bound and terrified between them, and called back over his shoulder as they rode east, back toward the Kane Ranch, back toward whatever dark reckoning was still ahead. Sundown tomorrow. Don't disappoint me. They rode off in a boil of dust, taking Jem with them, and Addie stood frozen in her own yard, with an empty rifle at her feet and 2 wounded men groaning in the dirt where they'd fallen, and every certainty she'd built over 8 careful years came apart, complete and sudden, like a rope finally giving way. 3 miles east, tied to a picket stake near the edge of Kane's east pasture, Jem sat through that first long night, with his wrists rubbed raw, and his mind working faster than his fear could keep pace with. He wasn't foolish enough to believe Colton meant to let him walk away from this, whatever promises got made over tomorrow's signing. He'd seen enough, back on that other spread 2 counties over, to understand exactly how men like Colton tidied up loose business once it no longer served a purpose. He'd run once already, rather than become a piece of loose business himself. He didn't run this time. Couldn't, bound as he was, and wouldn't have anyway, because running had never once brought him any place worth staying. Cedar Hollow had. Addie's kitchen table had. A dry loft and honest work, and a woman who'd looked him dead in the eye that first day and asked if he could keep his mouth shut, instead of asking nothing at all, the way most folks did with boys like him. So he sat in the dark, listening to Colton's men talk low around their fire, memorizing every word he could catch. Numbers. A meeting place. The particular careless way frightened, overconfident men speak when they've already decided their prisoner poses no further threat. He intended to be listening still, wide awake and watching, whenever the chance to be useful finally arrived. Whatever else came of tomorrow, Jem Sutter did not intend to be rescued as a burden. He intended, if the moment allowed it, to be rescued as a help. Back in the Prescott yard, Ezra Colquitt lowered his weapon slowly beside his daughter, weathered face carved deep with old grief and fresh fury in equal measure. "Addie," he said quietly, "I need you to listen now, really listen, because tomorrow at sundown we are going to get that boy back. But to do it, you're going to need to know the whole of it. About Colton, about who he truly works for, about why your husband truly died." Addie turned to face him, and whatever softness had crept back into her heart these past few days, whatever fragile peace she'd found in the rhythm of morning practice and quiet fireside talk, hardened now into something colder, something sharper, something that looked in that terrible moment exactly like the man standing beside her. "Then tell me," she said. "Tell me everything, Papa, because tomorrow I'm going to need every single thing you know." Wind moved cold and steady across the yard, carrying the last faint sound of retreating hoofbeats east toward the bighorns, east toward a reckoning years in the making. And Addie Prescott stood in the wreckage of her own quiet life, understanding with a clarity that settled deep into her bones that the woman she'd been for 8 careful years was already gone. What remained now was only her father's daughter, and tomorrow at sundown that daughter was going to war. The fire had burned to nothing but a memory of orange when Ezra finally told her the rest. Not the easy parts, not the parts he'd already given her by the dying coals. 2 nights back, the rest. The part he'd been holding, because some truths, he said, a father doesn't hand his daughter until the hour genuinely demands it. This hour demanded it. "Reese Colton isn't only hired muscle," Ezra said. His voice had gone low, flat, the voice of a man reciting something rehearsed 1,000 times in his own head and never once spoken aloud. 12 years back in Montana, there was a rancher named Holloway. Good man. Refused to sign his water rights over to the same railroad interests that now want this exact stretch of Wyoming opened up decades before its proper time. And Holloway's whole family died in a house fire that wasn't a house fire at all. Ezra's jaw tightened. The man who said it. The man I chased for 6 months after. The man I was ordered to look past and refused. The man whose face I put a bullet crease across before he escaped into the dark. He stopped. Couldn't finish it. Addie finished it for him. Colton. Younger then. Barely 20, but it was him. Ezra's hands, folded tight in his lap, were shaking now, just slightly, the way old grief shakes even in men who've spent a lifetime learning to hold it still. I carried that scar I gave him in my memory for 12 years, Addie girl. Wondered if he'd ever come looking to finish what got interrupted. Now I know. He has. And he doesn't even know yet that the woman standing between him and this land is my daughter. He told it slow, the way a man tells something he's spent years trying hard not to remember. The Holloway spread had sat in a river valley, good enough to make a railroad man weep with wanting it. Sarah Holloway kept a garden along the south wall of the house, tended so careful the whole valley knew her tomatoes, by reputation alone. 3 children, a hired hand who'd worked the place since before any of them were born. Ezra had ridden out there himself twice, in the weeks before, warning Holloway plain what kind of men he was dealing with. Holloway had thanked him for the concern and refused to sign regardless, because the water on his land fed 40 miles of downstream ranches that would wither without it, and he wasn't the sort of man who traded a whole valley's future for his own family's comfort. Ezra had been 3 miles off when he saw the smoke, rode in at a dead gallop, too late for anything but the fighting that followed, too late to do anything for the people already gone inside. He'd found Colton and another man still on the property, torches barely cold in their hands, and something in him that had spent a career keeping to the letter of the law simply stopped caring about the letter at all. The other man he'd killed clean. Colton he'd only wounded, a bullet creasing hot and fast along the younger man's temple, close enough to have ended things entirely if Ezra's horse hadn't stumbled at the exact wrong instant. Colton had run. Ezra had chased him 6 months across 2 territories before the trail went cold, before the men who'd hired Colton in the first place decided a marshal who wouldn't stop chasing was more trouble alive than a rancher's family had ever been. That was when they'd come for Ezra's own household instead. I've asked myself 1,000 times since, Ezra said quietly, whether chasing him so hard is what brought the danger down on you and your mother in the first place. Whether I'd have kept you both safer just letting him go and living with that failure quiet, instead of making myself a target worth silencing. His eyes found hers in the dark. Never did find an answer I could live easy with. You did what was right, Addie said, and meant it, though the words came out rougher than she intended. Doing right and doing safe aren't always the same road, Addie girl. That's a lesson I learned far too late, and I fear it's one you're about to learn again yourself before tomorrow's through. Addie sat with that a long moment. Wind moved cold across the hollow, stirring the dead fire's ashes into pale ghosts against the dark. He knows Jim, she said finally. He has Jim. I know, which means tomorrow at sundown, whatever happens, it isn't ending with a signature on a piece of paper. No, Ezra agreed quietly. It isn't. Because that was the truth sitting cold and heavy between them, the truth neither had said plain until just now. Because a man like Colton hadn't carried a grudge across 3 territories for 12 years only to settle, in the end, for land deeds and clean paperwork. Because whatever tomorrow brought, it was going to end the way these things always end out here, in country too wide and too lawless for anything but the oldest kind of justice, with guns. Then we'd best be ready, Addie said, and stood. And something in the set of her shoulders made Ezra look up sharp, because for one moment, in the failing light, she looked exactly like the man who'd taught her to shoot at a kitchen table over a decade before either of them had ever laid eyes on this territory. You look like your mother when you say things like that, he said softly, and you look like me when you mean them. They didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Instead they worked, methodical and quiet, laying every weapon Addie owned across the kitchen table where Wendell used to eat his supper, where Jim's empty chair sat, pushed in neat against the wall like an accusation. The Colt, cleaned, oiled, loaded full. Wendell's old shotgun, kept more for sentiment than use these past 2 years, brought down from above the hearth and checked twice over. A second pistol Ezra produced from his own saddlebag, older, heavier, a Remington that had seen better decades, but still, he swore, shot true. Colton will want a meeting place, Ezra said, laying out a hand-drawn map of the country between the Prescott homestead and the Kane ranch. Open ground, most likely. Somewhere he controls. Somewhere he can see us coming from a distance and set his men however he pleases. So we don't let him choose. We don't have much choice in the matter, Addie. He's got Jim. He sets the terms. He set the time. Addie's finger traced the map along the dry wash that cut between her property and the Kane land. narrow and steep-walled in places, the kind of ground a person could use if they knew it well enough. He didn't set the place. Not yet. Not until word comes tomorrow. Ezra looked at her a long moment, something sharpening behind his tired eyes. You're thinking about the canyon. I'm thinking we don't walk into whatever ground favors him. I'm thinking, if we can manage it, we choose the ground ourselves and make him come to us. She tapped the narrow gorge on the map, the one local folk called Widow's Cut, for reasons nobody quite remembered anymore. Though after tomorrow, she thought grimly, they might remember plenty, close enough to whatever meeting point he'll likely name. Close enough we can steer things there, careful, narrow enough that four riders can't spread, and flank the way they did in my own yard. Also, narrow enough that if it goes wrong, there's nowhere to run. Nowhere to run either way, Papa. The word came easier now, less startling each time it left her mouth. Not with Jem in their hands. Not with everything Wendell died protecting. Ezra studied her a long moment in the lamplight. Whatever he saw their determination, or grief, or some tangled combination of both, he recognized far too well from his own reflection, made him finally nod. Slow and heavy. Then Widow's Cut, he said. God help us both. There was a grim symmetry to the name, Addie thought, though she said nothing of it aloud. A canyon named for loss, about to become the ground on which she either lost everything further or finally stopped losing altogether. She wondered, briefly, what long-forgotten widow the place had originally been named for, some other woman in some earlier year who'd buried somebody dear to that narrow stretch of stone, and whether that woman had found, on the far side of her own grief, anything resembling the steadiness Addie was fighting so hard to hold on to now. She decided, sitting with the thought a moment longer, that it didn't much matter whose grief had named the place first. What mattered was what she did with her own, starting tomorrow at sundown. Later, alone for a few minutes while Ezra checked the horses, Addie sat on the porch step with the Colt heavy in her lap and let herself feel, for one unguarded moment, the full weight of what tomorrow might actually cost. Because for all her steady hands, for all the cold competence that had carried her through two dead men on this very porch, she was still only a woman who'd buried a husband 5 months back and was about to walk into gunfire to save a boy who wasn't even truly her own, alongside a father she'd known. In any real sense, for less than 2 weeks, the math of it, laid out plain in the dark, felt suddenly, terribly fragile. What if her hands failed her tomorrow the way they never had before? What if precision gave way to panic the moment it mattered most? What if she'd spent 8 years building a quiet, ordinary life only to lose everyone in it inside a single violent evening, Jem and Ezra both, and end up exactly as alone as the town had always assumed she already was? She sat with the fear a long while, not fighting it, the way her father had taught her to sit with recoil, instead of flinching against it. Fear, she was coming to understand, wasn't the opposite of courage at all. It was simply the price courage cost, paid in full before the courage itself ever got spent. By the time Ezra returned, leading the horses saddled and ready, she'd folded the fear down small enough to carry without it showing on her face. Not gone, simply put where it needed to be, until tomorrow's fight was finished and there was room again to feel it properly. Word came at first light, carried by one of Kane's own riders, too nervous to dismount, tossing a folded paper into the yard before wheeling his horse and riding off without a word. Addie unfolded it with hands that had finally mercifully stopped shaking. Sundown, the dry wash south of Kane's East Pasture. Come alone with the papers signed. Boy stays alive only if you do exactly as told. East Pasture? Ezra murmured, reading over her shoulder. That runs straight into Widow's Cut from the northern end. Then that's where they'll bring him through. Addie. His voice had gone careful. I need you to understand something before we do this. Colton isn't going to hand the boy over and ride off peaceful, whatever this note might promise. Men like him don't leave witnesses to what they've done. Once he has what he came for, he kills Jem anyway. Likely. Yes. The words sat ugly and plain in the morning light, and something in Addie's chest went cold and hard and absolutely certain. Then we don't give him the chance to finish that particular piece of business, she said. We take Jem back before any papers ever change hands. That's not the plan he's expecting. No, Addie said, and something almost like her father's own dangerous calm settled into her voice. It isn't. They rode out 2 hours before sundown, taking the long way through country, Addie had walked 100 times over 8 quiet years. Country she knew now, in ways that felt suddenly urgently useful. Ezra rode beside her, older, slower, but steady, the Remington heavy on his hip, and something grim and focused settled into his weathered face that made him look. For the first time since she'd met him on the road with his lame horse, entirely capable of the violence his history suggested, the land itself seemed to hold its breath around them, sagebrush going, purple in the slanting light. A hawk circling once, high overhead, before wheeling off toward the mountains, like even it wanted no part of what was coming. Addie's mind kept circling back to small, useless things the exact color of Jem's eyes when he'd first walked up her road with that canvas sack, the particular way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him, a sound she realized, with a small ache, she hadn't heard nearly often enough these past weeks. Because grief has a habit of visiting early before it's earned. Because some part of her was already grieving a boy who was, God willing, still very much alive 3 miles ahead. Which meant that part of her needed silencing, needed setting aside entirely, because grief and a stedged trigger finger had never once shared the same hand well. She breathed, counted the breath, let it go, the way her father had taught her a lifetime ago, and found the steadiness waiting underneath, right where it had always been. They left their horses tied a half-mile out and went the rest of the way on foot, low and quiet, moving through scrub brush and broken rock toward the northern rim of Widow's Cut. Below them, the dry wash cut a narrow scar through the land, walls of pale stone rising steep on either side, funneling down toward the flat meeting ground Colton had named. There, Ezra's whisper, pointing, 4 horses tied loose near the wash's southern mouth, 3 riders visible, lounging in the long shadows, rifles across their laps, and between 2 of them, hands still bound, sitting slumped against a boulder, a bruise blooming dark along one cheekbone. Jem. Alive. That was the only thing that mattered in the whole world. In that instant, the only fact Addie's racing heart could hold on to. Alive, and breathing, and close enough now, that every instinct in her screamed to run down there and simply take him back by force. She didn't. Because rushing meant dying, meant leaving Jem exactly as trapped as before, only with nobody left free to come save him at all. Her father's voice again, threading through her thoughts, steady where her own thoughts wanted to fray. Watch! Wait! Choose your moment. Where's Colton? She breathed. Ezra scanned the wash a long moment before answering. Not down there, he said finally, voice gone tight and careful. Which means he's already somewhere up here with us, waiting to see what we do. The words had barely left his mouth when a voice spoke from the rocks behind them. Calm, almost pleasant, close enough that Addie's whole body went rigid with the shock of it. Very good instincts, Reese Colton said. Both of you. Though I confess, old man, I didn't expect the widow to bring company at all. The note was quite specific. Alone. Addie turned, slow, hands carefully away from her weapon, and found Colton standing not 10 feet off, a rifle held loose but ready in his hands. His 3 riders below, apparently only a fraction of the men he'd actually brought. You didn't really expect me to come alone, Addie said. Not after what you did in my own yard. No, Colton admitted, something almost like amusement crossing his lean face. I suppose I didn't. His eyes drifted to Ezra, studied him a long moment, and something shifted behind his gaze. Old recognition, surfacing slow and cold. Do I know you, old man? We've met, Ezra said quietly. Have we? Colton's head tilted slightly. I don't forget faces. Not ones that matter. His eyes narrowed, tracing the lines of Ezra's weathered features, and Addie watched the exact moment recognition landed. Watched his whole body go still and sharp with it. Montana, he said slowly. The Holloway business. You're the marshal who put a bullet across my head and left me bleeding in a burning barn while you chased witnesses who never should have survived the night at all. You murdered a family, Colton. A whole family, for a railroad's convenience. I did a job. Colton's voice had gone flat and cold, all pleasant amusement stripped away in an instant. Same job I'm doing now, Marshal. Though I understand you don't go by that name anymore. Funny thing, though. Funny how the daughter of the man who nearly killed me 12 years back turns out sitting on exactly the ground my current employers need cleared. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. World's a small place, isn't it? Let the boy go, Colton. Now why would I do that? Colton's rifle came up, unhurried, level. You've cost me 12 years of wondering whether you survived that fire, Marshal. 12 years looking over my shoulder, wondering when a bullet with your name on it might finally find me. I think, all things considered, I'm owed a great deal more than a boy's freedom. Everything happened very fast after that. Later, trying to piece it together, Addie would remember it only in fragments, disconnected and strange, the way violence always seems to move faster than the mind can properly follow. Ezra moved first, throwing himself sideways as Colton's rifle fired, the shot cracking off canyon rock inches from where he'd stood a half-second before. Addie's own hand found the Colt at her hip in the same motion she'd practiced 100 times these past weeks. Draw and fire, draw and fire, her father's patient voice threading through her mind even as her body moved without waiting for permission. Her shot caught Colton's rifle arm, spinning him half around with a cry of pain and fury, and below in the wash, his riders were already moving, shouting, scrambling for cover and weapons both. Jim. Addie screamed, and below she saw the boy jerk upright against his boulder, saw him fighting his bound wrists with sudden desperate strength, saw one of Colton's riders start toward him with a knife already drawn. She didn't think, didn't calculate distance or angle or risk. She simply moved, scrambling down the steep canyon wall in a controlled fall more than a climb, rifle abandoned for the Colt, still hot in her hand, and fired twice into the man closing on Jem before her boots had properly found the canyon floor. Both shots found their mark. He fell and didn't rise. Her ears rang from her own gunfire, that particular high whine that swallowed every other sound in the world for one dangerous, disoriented instant. She forced herself through it, forced her eyes to keep moving. Keep counting, the way her father had drilled into her. Count your enemies. Count your cover. Count your remaining shots before you ever count anything else. The remaining two riders opened fire from the wash's southern mouth, and Addie threw herself behind a boulder as bullets chewed the stone above her head, dust and rock chips raining down, one splinter of stone opening a shallow cut along her cheekbone that she wouldn't even notice until hours later. Above her, on the rim, she could hear Ezra's Remington answering steady and precise, could hear one of Colton's men cry out. For a moment that felt far longer than it truly was, the canyon became nothing but noise and dust, and the particular terrible arithmetic of who still had ammunition and who was already reloading. Addie's hands moved without her permission, thumbing fresh cartridges into the Colt's cylinder with fingers that somehow, impossibly, didn't fumble even once. Because this was the moment her father had spent every early morning preparing her for, whether either of them had said so plainly or not. Not the mornings of quiet practice against a fence post, but this exact narrow stretch of ground, this exact roar of gunfire, this exact impossible math of protecting the people she loved against men who'd already decided their lives were worth less than a railroad's convenience. She rose from cover just enough to sight down the barrel, and fired once more toward the muzzle flash she'd marked in the smoke. One of the two remaining riders went down hard, wounded through the leg, dropping his weapon and dragging himself behind a fallen log, with his hands raised high and empty, shouting something that sounded very much like surrender. "Addie!" Jem's voice, hoarse and desperate. "Behind you, ma'am! Behind you!" She spun in time to see the last standing rider rounding her cover, gun already leveled. And there wasn't time to aim properly. Wasn't time for anything but pure trained instinct taking over completely, her body moving through the motion her father had drilled into her 1,000 times these past weeks. And, before that, 1,000 times more at a kitchen table over a decade ago. Her shot took him center chest. He fell without a sound. Silence rushed in after. The particular ringing silence that follows violence, broken only by her own ragged breathing, by the wounded man's low groaning behind the log, and by Jem's muffled sobbing relief as she finally reached him, cutting his bound wrists free with a knife pulled from her boot. "You came," he said, voice cracking. I thought maybe. I told you I'd come." Addie pulled him upright, checked the bruise on his cheek with hands that had finally, mercifully, gone steady again. "You're safe now, Jem. You're safe." Above them, on the canyon rim, a single gunshot cracked out, sudden and final, and Addie's heart stopped cold in her chest. "Papa!" She was scrambling back up the canyon wall before the echo had even finished rolling away. Jem stumbling after her, and what she found at the top made her whole world tilt sideways. Ezra Colquitt lay on his back in the dust, blood spreading dark and fast across his shirt front, and standing over him, rifle arm hanging useless, but a second pistol clutched now in his good hand. Reese Colton looked down at his old enemy with an expression of terrible, satisfied finality. 12 years, Colton said, breathing hard, blood soaking his own sleeve where Addie's first shot had caught him. 12 years I've waited to finish this, Marshal. Funny how it ends. Funnier still that it's your own daughter's land that finally brought us back together. Get away from him. Colton's eyes lifted to Addie, standing frozen at the canyon rim with her Colt, raised and shaking now. Actually shaking, for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun. Ah, he said softly. There you are, I said. Get away from him. You could shoot me, Colton said, almost conversational, though the pistol in his good hand never wavered from where it hovered near Ezra's chest. You're fast. Faster than I expected. Certainly faster than any of my men gave you credit for. But I promise you this, Mrs. Prescott. However fast you are, I'm faster with this trigger than you are with that draw. Put a bullet in me. I put one in him first. Guaranteed. Addie. Ezra's voice, weak blood bubbling faintly at the corner of his mouth. Don't you dare trade yourself for. Quiet, old man. Colton's boot pressed a warning against Ezra's wounded shoulder, drawing a sharp gasp of pain. Your daughter and I are having a conversation. Addie's mind raced, fragments of thought tumbling faster than she could grab hold of any single one. Because there wasn't a clean shot. Because Colton stood too close, too careful, using her father's body as both hostage and shield. Because every instinct screaming at her to fire was matched by an equal certainty that firing meant watching her father die in the same breath as pulling the trigger. Which left nothing. Which left an impossible choice, dressed up as a conversation. Colton had no intention of losing. Lower the gun, Mrs. Prescott. Colton's voice had gone almost gentle, the particular gentleness of a man who already believes he's won. I'll let the old man live long enough to watch me finish what we started, and then I'll let him die slow, knowing exactly what his stubbornness cost. Or you lower the gun now, and I make it quick for him instead. Your choice. I'm a reasonable man, in the end. You're not reasonable, Addie said, voice shaking despite herself. You're a coward who burns families in their beds and calls it a job. Something flickered across Colton's face at that. Not quite anger. Something closer to recognition, as though the accusation had landed somewhere he'd long ago stopped letting himself feel. Careful, he said. Quiet. Careful, Mrs. Prescott. Because he wasn't wrong about the arithmetic, whatever else he was wrong about. There genuinely wasn't a shot, Addie trusted. Not with her father's body wedged so close beneath Colton's boot. Not with her hands shaking the way they hadn't shaken since two dead men first bled onto her porch. Every second that passed was a second Colton controlled completely, and both of them seemed to understand it in exactly the same terrible instant. Until Jem moved. She didn't see it happen. Would never quite piece together, afterward, exactly how the boy had circled wide and silent through the brush, while Colton's whole attention fixed on Addie, exactly how he'd found the fallen rifle from the man she'd shot minutes before, exactly how a 16-year-old boy bound and terrified an hour earlier found the steady nerve to do what he did next. But the rifle cracked once, from behind. From an angle Colton never saw coming, and the outlaw's whole body jerked sideways, the pistol firing wild into empty air as he crumpled into the dust beside the man he'd meant to kill. Silence again. Complete and total. Addie was moving before she'd fully understood what happened, dropping to her knees beside her father, hands pressing hard against the wound in his shoulder, blood hot and slick between her fingers. Papa! Papa! Stay with me! Stay, Addie girl! Ezra's eyes found hers, glassy but somehow, impossibly, still finding room for something like pride amid the pain. That boy just saved both our lives. Don't talk. Save your strength. She looked up, found Jem standing frozen a few feet off, rifle still smoking in his hands, his whole young face gone pale and shocked at what he'd just done. Jem, I need you to ride for the doctor now. Fast as that horse will carry you. Jem didn't move for a long moment, staring down at Colton's still body, at the blood, at the sheer enormity of what had just happened in the space of a few violent minutes. Jem. The sharpness in her voice finally broke through, and he nodded, dropping the rifle, sprinting for the horses tied below. Addie turned back to her father, pressing harder against the wound, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between grief and wonder, and a strange, exhausted peace. "You did it," he murmured. "Everything I taught you. Everything I was afraid I'd never get the chance to see you use properly. The way it was meant. You did it exactly right. Stop talking like this is over, Papa. Stop talking like you're saying goodbye." I'm not. His hand, weak but steady, found hers where it pressed against his shoulder. "I've got a great deal more to say to you, Addie girl. Over a decade of it, matter of fact. I intend to say every last word." Behind them, down near the log, the wounded man who'd surrendered stirred weakly, hands still raised, watching the two of them with the wide, careful eyes of a man who understood exactly how close he'd come to sharing the fate of his companions, and exactly how much he now needed the mercy of the people he'd helped hunt. Jem's gallop into town left a trail of gawking faces behind him, shopkeepers and wives and idle men outside the saloon, all turning at the sound of a boy riding like the devil himself was chasing him, shouting the doctor's name before he'd even properly reined in. Word moved through Cedar Hollow faster than any single rider could carry it, the way word always does in small places, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, growing stranger and larger with every retelling. By the time the doctor's buggy rattled out past the east pasture, half the town had already heard some version of the story. A gunfight. The Prescott widow. That drifter who'd been seen at her place, Reese Colton, of all people, laid low at last. Front doors that had stayed carefully shut through weeks of quiet trouble suddenly opened wide. Neighbors stepping out onto porches to watch the doctor's buggy pass, murmuring amongst themselves in a way that had nothing left of pity in it at all, and everything of astonishment. The doctor arrived within the hour, summoned by a boy who'd ridden into Cedar Hollow at a dead gallop, shouting for help loud enough to bring half the town out onto the street. Behind him, following at a more cautious pace but following all the same, rode three men Addie had never expected to see moving with any particular urgency. Sheriff Amos Pratt, his usual folksy calm, replaced by something pale and shaken. Two deputies, both looking equally uncertain about whatever they'd been told, was waiting for them out past the east pasture. Word traveled fast in a town like Cedar Hollow. By the time Pratt's horse reined up at the mouth of Widow's Cut, half the details were already twisted into rumor, but the core of it a gunfight, dead men. The notorious Reese Colton, laid out in the dust, had reached him clear enough to shake even his practiced indifference. He dismounted slow, surveying the scene with an expression Addie couldn't quite read. Colton's body. Two more riders dead nearby. A third wounded and bound now with his own belt, watching the proceedings with the particular attentiveness of a man calculating how much cooperation might buy him. "Mrs. Prescott." Pratt's voice had lost its usual folksy warmth entirely. "This is quite a scene." "It is. Reese Colton. Dead. In my county." He rubbed a hand across his gray mustache, and for the first time since Addie had known him, something like genuine fear moved behind his eyes. "Territorial Marshal's office is going to want a very thorough accounting." "Good," Addie said, "because I have one to give them. And so does he." She nodded toward the wounded bound man by the log. "I expect he'll have a great deal to say once he understands his choices are cooperation, or the same rope Reese Colton's dead men no longer need worry about." Something in her voice made Pratt look up sharp, and whatever he saw in her face steady, unflinching, utterly without the fear he'd clearly been counting on all these weeks, made him take an involuntary step back. "Mrs. Prescott, I don't think you understand the position this puts." "I understand it perfectly, Sheriff." Addie stepped closer, and her voice, when it came, carried the particular quiet weight of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything left to say. "I understand Reese Colton came to this territory on Silas Kane's payroll to force me off land my husband died protecting. I understand you took money to bury the report on the first attack against my home. I understand you've spent the past month telling me, over and over, how wise it would be to simply give up and sell." Her eyes never left his. "And I understand every piece of that is about to become very public knowledge, Sheriff, whether you cooperate with the territorial investigation or whether you don't." Pratt's face had gone the color of old ash. "What do you want?" he said finally. voice barely above a whisper. I want you to do your job, Addie said, for once. Properly. Starting with placing Silas Kane under arrest before word of what happened here reaches him, and he decides to run. They found Silas Kane in his study, exactly where he'd been standing days earlier when he'd first spoken Colton's name aloud, watching the same darkening view of the bighorns through the same fine window. He didn't run, didn't reach for a weapon, just turned, slow and resigned. When Pratt's deputies came through his door with rifles raised, and something in his carefully composed face finally, completely gave way. I assume, he said quietly, that Colton failed. Colton's dead, Pratt said. And something in his own voice had changed too. The careful, folksy performance of the past month stripped away entirely, replaced by something closer to the lawman he might once have intended to be. Along with 3 of his men, Mrs. Prescott and her father are alive. Kane's shoulders sagged just slightly, the fine posture of 20 years' careful ambition finally cracking under its own weight. Back at the Prescott house, the town doctor kept Ezra abed for the better part of a week, and for the first 2 days of it, refused to say anything definite about his patient's chances, which frightened Addie considerably more than plain bad news would have managed. The bullet missed the lung, he told her finally, on the 3rd morning, wiping his hands on a cloth already dark with use. Missed the major vessels too, near as I can tell, though there's always a chance of trouble I won't see clear until fever sets in proper. He's no longer a young man, Mrs. Prescott, and blood loss like this asks a great deal of a body his age. But he'll live. I believe so. I won't promise it. Promising is a fool's game in this line of work. The doctor studied her a moment. Something gentler entering his professional manner. He kept asking after you, in the worst of the fever last night. Wouldn't settle enough to rest proper till somebody assured him you were safe. Addie sat with her father, through that fever, changing the dressing, spooning broth between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, holding his hand through the worst of the shaking when he wasn't, she thought, more than once during those long hours. About all the years she'd already spent, keeping a very different kind of vigil over a grave that had held nothing but rocks and a borrowed coat. This time, whatever else came of it, she was watching over the real thing, and that difference alone made the fear worth carrying. There's a ledger, he said before anybody had asked. In my desk. Every payment. Every correspondence. 3 years back. I kept it, foolishly perhaps, as insurance against exactly this kind of moment. The ledger, once opened, told the rest of the story more plainly than any confession could have managed. Names. Dates. Payments authorized from a rail development company headquartered far off in Chicago. A company with fingers in 6 territorial land disputes stretching from Montana clean down through Colorado. Always the same pattern. Land needed for rail expansion, cleared through violence, dressed up as accident or misfortune. And there, finally, in the surveyor's notes tucked among Kane's careful pages, sat the answer to the one question that had shadowed every terrible thing that happened since the night 2 men first broke into a widow's home. The Prescott homestead sat at the single viable crossing point through this stretch of the bighorns. The only ground, low enough, flat enough, well-watered enough to support a rail line, connecting 2 major expansion routes the company had spent the better part of a decade quietly planning. Every other approach through these mountains meant grades too steep for a locomotive, or terrain that would add as months and untold thousands to a project already years deep in the planning. Addie's land wasn't simply valuable. It was, in the surveyor's own careful words, essentially irreplaceable. The single reason a farmer's widow had been worth murdering a husband over, worth hiring an outlaw with a 12-year-old grudge over, worth risking exposure across 6 territories to acquire. They could have offered me a fortune, Addie said, turning the pages over in her hands days later, understanding at last the full shape of everything that had happened. Could have offered more money than Wendell and I ever dreamed of, and I likely would have sold if they'd simply been honest about what this ground was truly worth. Men like that don't deal honest when they can deal cheap, Ezra said, sitting up now in the spare room bed where he'd spent the past week recovering, color slowly returning to his weathered face. Cheaper to threaten a widow than pay her fair value. Cheaper still to kill her husband and hope she simply gives up and moves along. They miscalculated. They did. Something almost like a smile moved across his face. Badly. Men who see people only as ground to be cleared tend to forget, sooner or later, that the ground sometimes fights back. The territorial hearing convened in Buffalo 3 weeks later in a courthouse too small for the crowd that turned out to watch it. Word of the Widow's Cut gunfight had traveled far enough by then that curious faces filled every bench. Ranchers and homesteaders, and more than a few newspapermen down from Cheyenne, all of them come to see for themselves. The woman half the territory was already calling, in hushed and half-disbelieving tones, the deadliest thing to happen to Wyoming since the winter of the hard freeze. Addie stood before a panel of grim-faced men and told her story plain, start to finish, without embellishment and without apology. The night of the first attack, the map hidden in Wendell's things, the sheriff's bribed silence, the canyon and everything that had happened inside it. She didn't cry telling it. Didn't need to. The facts alone, laid out in careful order, carried weight enough on their own. And you fired the shots that ended Mr. Colton's men. The territorial prosecutor asked her, not unkindly, in defense of your own life, and the boys, and your father's. I did, Addie said. I'd do every one of them again, given the same choice and the same night. A murmur moved through the gallery at that, though whether it was disapproval or something closer to admiration, Addie couldn't rightly say and found she didn't much care either way. She hadn't come to Buffalo seeking the town's blessing. She'd come seeking the truth entered plainly into a record that couldn't be quietly buried the way her husband's death had been. Ezra testified after her, his voice steadier than his body still was, laying out 12 years of history the territorial authorities had never once suspected lay buried beneath a false grave in Montana. The surviving rider testified last, and testified eagerly, a man who'd ridden into Widow's Cut, expecting easy wages, and ridden out of it, instead with a bullet through his leg and a clear enough view of his own mortality to make cooperation feel like the only sensible choice remaining to him. He named names Addie had never heard before. Paymasters in Cheyenne. A lawyer in Denver who'd drafted the false coroner's report on Wendell's death for a fee large enough to buy his silence twice over. Each new name drew the whole conspiracy tighter, thread by careful thread, until no lawyer in the territory could talk any of it loose again. Why confess it all so freely, the prosecutor asked him near the end. You might have simply held your tongue. The rider glanced once toward Addie, sitting straight-backed in the gallery, before answering. Because I watched that woman put down 3 of Colton's best men without hardly blinking, he said. And I figured a man in my position was better served telling the truth to a judge than staying quiet and hoping she never came looking for the rest of us. The weeks that followed carried Cedar Hollow through a reckoning the whole territory would talk about for years after. Silas Kane stood trial in Buffalo before a courtroom packed tighter than any in the territory's short history, and when the verdict finally came down, he received 15 years for his part in the conspiracy, his ranch and holdings seized to settle claims brought by families across 3 territories who'd suffered the same pattern of violence he'd helped orchestrate. He said nothing at his sentencing beyond a single quiet acknowledgement that he understood the charges against him, and Addie, watching from the gallery, found she felt less satisfaction in the moment than she'd expected, and more simply a tired, hollowed-out relief that the whole business had finally reached its end. Sheriff Pratt, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony, kept himself clear of prison but lost his badge for good, leaving Cedar Hollow, within the month, unable to face a town that had finally learned what kind of man had worn its star all those years. A younger sheriff arrived that spring, a serious, soft-spoken man named Caldwell who'd cut his teeth keeping order in a rougher county further south, and one of his first acts in office was to ride out personally to the Prescott homestead, hat in hand, to introduce himself properly. Wanted you to know, Mrs. Prescott, he said, standing awkward in her yard, that whatever happened here before my time, it won't happen again while I wear this badge. You've my word on that. I appreciate the word, Sheriff. I've learned, though, to set more store by actions than promises. Fair enough. Something that might have been respect crossed his face. I expect you've earned the right to feel that way. Addie found, in the months that followed, that Caldwell was a man who kept his word regardless of whether she set store by it or not, and slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to trust the law in Cedar Hollow again, a little at a time, The way trust generally has to be rebuilt once it's been thoroughly broken. And the investigation, built on Kane's ledger and the surviving writer's own desperate testimony, eventually reached clean past Wyoming Territory, implicating railroad executives in Chicago, whose names Addie would read in newspapers for a full year after, with a grim satisfaction that never quite faded into simple relief. Jem stayed on, of course, wore the town's sudden fascination with him, uncomfortably, ducking his head whenever somebody tried to buy him a meal on the strength of what he'd done in that canyon. And when Addie finally asked him plainly whether he wanted to move on, chase whatever bigger opportunities a boy who'd stood down Reese Colton might now find open to him, he only turned his hat over in his hands, the same nervous way he had that very first day on the North Road, and told her he'd already found the only thing he'd ever been looking for. Somewhere to belong. She kept him, gladly, and she kept Ezra too, once he'd healed enough to argue about it. Though by then, neither of them had much appetite left for arguing. He built a small cabin at the edge of the property, close enough to walk to supper most evenings, far enough to give them both the particular kind of room two people rebuilding a dozen lost years sometimes need. And the three of them fell into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in longer than Addie could properly measure, something very close to family. Her first trip back into Cedar Hollow proper, once Ezra could sit a wagon without wincing, felt like walking into a town she'd never actually lived in before. The same mercantile owner who'd once weighed her flour a little generous out of pity now came around the counter himself to shake her hand, calling her Mrs. Prescott with something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Respect, maybe, or something close enough to it. The women outside the dry goods store no longer lowered their voices when she passed. Some of them met her eye entirely, nodded, offered small, genuine smiles that carried none of the old careful performance. Word travels, Whitlow told her, ringing up her purchases. When a woman puts an end to trouble like that, whole territories talking about it. Newspapers as far off as Cheyenne, even. I didn't do it for talk, Addie said. No, he agreed. I don't expect you did, which is likely why folks are talking about it so much. She rode home that afternoon with her supplies and a strange, unfamiliar feeling riding alongside her that she eventually identified as belonging, though not the desperate, borrowed belonging of a girl building a life on somebody else's steadiness, something earned instead, something entirely her own. The seasons turned the way seasons do, indifferent to everything that had nearly ended beneath them. Autumn brought a harvest better than any Addie had managed alone. 4 extra hands where there'd once been only 2, and a cellar stocked full enough that winter no longer felt like something to be merely survived. Snow came early and stayed late, the way it does in that country, and the three of them spent the long white months mending tack by the fire, Ezra telling stories at last instead of guarding them, stories about a young marshal and an even younger bride, about a valley in Montana before any of it went wrong. Spring found Jem grown a full inch taller and steadier in the shoulders, no longer the thin, hungry boy who'd walked up the North Road with everything he owned in a canvas sack. He'd started reading in the evenings, slow and determined, out of books Ezra brought him from town, and Addie caught herself watching him some nights with an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with grief at all. Pride, she realized eventually. Something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long while. On the evening of the first anniversary of Wendell's death, Addie finally did the one thing she'd been avoiding since the funeral. She climbed the small rise above the creek and set a proper marker into the ground at last, carved simple and honest with his name, and the years that bracketed a good, steady life. Ezra came to stand beside her as the sun went down gold and heavy over the bighorns, and neither of them spoke for a long while, the particular silence of two people who no longer needed every moment filled with words. He'd be proud of you, Ezra said finally. The woman you've become. The way you protected everything he built. He'd be proud of both of us, Addie said, and reached over, took her father's weathered hand in her own steady one. Took us both long enough to get here. 12 years for me, Ezra agreed, something wet catching in his voice. 1 long, hard year for you. But we made it, Addie girl. Both of us. Finally. They stood together a while longer, watching the last color drain slow out of the western sky, and Addie found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of the Colt still riding on her hip. Her father's gun once. Her own now, fully and completely, in every sense the word could carry. "I've been teaching Jim," she said eventually. "Properly, I mean. Same as you taught me." Ezra glanced at her, something complicated moving behind his tired eyes. "How's he taking to it?" "Better than I did, if I'm honest. Steadier hands. Though I don't imagine he'll ever need it the way I did. Not that way, God willing. None of us ever will again. Every family needs somebody who knows how to protect it," Ezra said quietly. "Doesn't mean the knowing gets used often. Only means it's there, waiting, in case the day ever comes calling." Is that what this was? Addie's hand drifted, without quite meaning to, toward Wendell's marker. A family, finally protecting itself? "That's exactly what it was," Ezra said. 12 years too late for some of it. Right on time for the rest. Behind them, down at the house, lamplight spilled warm and golden from the kitchen window, where Jim was setting the table for supper, humming some tuneless song under his breath. Home, in every sense that mattered. Addie looked out at the land Wendell had loved so fiercely, the land that had cost so much, and taught her, in the end, exactly who she truly was beneath 8 years of careful, ordinary living. She was not the frightened widow the town had once pitied. Was not the desperate girl who'd fled Montana at 18, carrying a stolen name and a father's gun. Was not any longer defined by loss or fear, or the careful smallness she'd once taught herself to wear. She was Adeline Prescott, farmer fighter, daughter of a man who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe, and who had, against every reasonable expectation, finally come home to see the woman that sacrifice made possible. The land was hers, fully hers, earned through blood and grief and a courage she hadn't known. She carried until the exact night it mattered most. Earned, too, through the quiet, unglamorous work of every ordinary day that came after the mending, the planting, the simple act of choosing, morning after morning, to keep building rather than to give up and walk away. Somewhere out past the bighorns, a railroad would come through, eventually, honest this time, carrying with it all the ordinary progress that had cost so many lives to secure fairly. Towns would grow up along its route. Cattle would ship east in numbers nobody in Cedar Hollow had yet imagined. The wide, wild country Addie had known her whole married life would slowly, inevitably, become something else entirely, the way all frontiers eventually do, tamed by the very steel rails men had once been willing to kill for. But the creek would keep running the way it always had, through the good bottom ground Wendell had loved enough to build a whole life around. The graves on the little rise would keep watch over it, husband and father both, two very different men, who'd each given everything they had to keep the same woman safe. And whatever came next, whatever new shape the territory took in the years ahead, this particular corner of it would remain exactly what it had always been meant to be: home, fought for, held on to, never again taken for granted. And whatever new trouble the wide, wild territory might someday bring to her door, Adeline Prescott would meet it exactly the way she'd met everything else. Standing tall, steady hands, ready.